Chapter 581, The Fourth Stage. At Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, conflicts among young wizards are commonplace. In the throes of adolescence, it's not unusual for students to resort to their wands or even their fists when disagreements arise. However, in all their years at Hogwarts, Harry and Hermione had never witnessed anything quite like Neville Longbottom drawing a sword and pointing it at someone's head. Even the Slytherins were taken aback by Neville's boldness. They stared in stunned silence at Longbottom, who stood panting heavily, his eyes blazing with intensity. The silence was short-lived. A cacophony of laughter erupted, led by Pansy Parkinson. "What are you doing, Longbottom?" she jeered. "Trying to take on Draco with a piece of iron? Look at you. You look ridiculous." The Slytherins were too amused to immediately rally behind Draco, their laughter so intense that tears streamed down their faces. Meanwhile, the Gryffindors remained eerily quiet, with only Hermione breaking the silence, her voice filled with a mix of sadness and urgency. "Stop it, Neville." Draco Malfoy, despite the absurdity of the situation, couldn't help but feel a chill from the determined look in Neville's eyes. The tension was palpable, and it seemed the confrontation would escalate further until Atticus Blaine, the professor, intervened. He entered the classroom, his presence immediately commanding attention. The students, previously engrossed in the spectacle, hadn't noticed Professor Blaine standing at the door. With his arrival, the atmosphere shifted. Slytherin students quickly adjusted their badges, while those from Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw adopted more serious expressions. Neville, realizing the gravity of the situation, lowered his sword. Harry and his friends seized the opportunity to voice their grievances, accusing Slytherin of their evil deeds. "We didn't do anything," Malfoy protested, his voice tinged with indignation. "We were just supporting Granger in our own way." "You're lying, Malfoy," Harry retorted angrily. He pointed at the badge on Malfoy's chest, noticing that Malfoy wore it with pride, as if daring Professor Blaine to take a closer look. This struck Harry as odd. Upon closer inspection, he saw that the Slytherin badges had changed. Now, they bore a respectful image of Hermione with the words, "Hermione Granger, the true warrior of Hogwarts." "That wasn't what it looked like before, Professor Blaine," Harry exclaimed, his voice filled with frustration. The Gryffindors crowded around Professor Blaine, each eager to recount the 3 transformations of the badge. Professor Blaine cast a glance at Draco, who feigned innocence, and couldn't help but admire the boy's cunning. Nevertheless, as a professor, he had to maintain his dignity and impartiality. Under the watchful eyes of Harry and his friends, Professor Blaine approached the scene with a calm demeanor. He paused beside Neville, who was still clutching the sword awkwardly, and offered a rare smile. "Not bad. Quite impressive." Draco burst into laughter, mistaking the compliment for sarcasm. However, when Professor Blaine's gaze shifted to him, Draco felt an unfamiliar pressure and immediately straightened up, adopting a more respectful posture. With a swift motion, Professor Blaine gestured, and the bag in Draco's hand flew into his own. He extracted a badge, examining it closely. Atticus Blaine placed the object in his palm, scrutinizing it with a cold gaze. "Who made this?" he demanded. Draco Malfoy lowered his head, his gray eyes filled with conflict. As he hesitated over whether to tell the truth, a member of the Slytherin team suddenly raised a small, pale hand. "It was me, Professor Blaine," said Astoria Greengrass, the youngest member of the Slytherin team. She tried to maintain her composure under Professor Blaine's intense scrutiny. "Your transfiguration skills are impressive," Atticus nodded slightly. The Gryffindor students stared at Professor Blaine's back in disbelief. They couldn't fathom that he would actually commend back Slytherin's actions. Before Draco could revel in the praise, Professor Blaine's next words dashed his hopes. "I recall instructing you all to wholeheartedly support the champions from various schools. Even if you can't manage that, you must not hinder them," Professor Blaine stated calmly. "I don't want to see anyone wearing this kind of thing again in the castle. Otherwise, whatever the champions face in their first task, you will face it one by one." "What exactly are the champions up against, Professor?" The Weasley twins, ever opportunistic, seized the moment. George immediately raised his hand and asked, "Oh?" Atticus turned around, a smile playing on his lips. "If I tell you, will you keep it a secret?" George was momentarily taken aback, then exclaimed excitedly, "I swear I'll keep it secret, Professor." The entire classroom buzzed with excitement, each student eager to learn some top-secret information from Professor Blaine. "I swore that too, Mr. Weasley." Atticus's cheerful laughter was met with a chorus of disappointed sighs. "All right, joke time is over." He clapped his hands, gathering the students' attention. Looking at their eager faces illuminated by the firelight, he continued calmly, "Over the past 2 months, you've practiced spells for self-protection against other wizards. From my observations, nearly everyone has met the requirements." Clang, clang, a suit of armor on the classroom wall rattled, swaying as if dissatisfied and peering at the students. "Oh," Atticus slapped his forehead. "Return the sword, Mr. Longbottom. It's not yours." Amidst a wave of snickers, Neville, his face flushed with embarrassment, hurried to return the sword to its scabbard. Nervous, he fumbled several times, accidentally tearing his robes, which only increased the laughter. However, when he rejoined his Gryffindor classmates, Hermione discreetly repaired his robes. "Next, we need to adjust the curriculum. From now on, the last class on Friday mornings will be dedicated to practicing dodging dung bombs and reinforcing your magical skills. Wednesday's class will focus on practical combat." "Practical combat?" Hannah Abbott from Hufflepuff exclaimed. Realizing Professor Blaine was looking at her, she became flustered and stammered, "Practical combat? But with whom?" Professor Blaine's announcement sent a wave of excitement through the class. Truthfully, few were afraid. Most were eager. The students who participated in physical education classes often felt a sense of superiority, wanting to prove they were better than others. However, Professor Blaine strictly prohibited using wands in combat, so they could only bask in the envious glances of their peers when demonstrating new magic. They eagerly anticipated the chance to test their skills against others, to truly understand their own power. "Before answering this question," Atticus Blaine said in a cautious tone, "I need you to form your own team. This isn't about grouping by colleges, it's about creating your own small team, consisting of 3 people. You are free to choose teammates from different colleges, but remember, this team is not temporary. It will remain intact throughout the upcoming courses and even when you face real challenges in the future. Therefore, I urge you to choose your teammates wisely." End of this chapter. Chapter 582, Team Formation and the Real Duel. After taking a few deep breaths, Atticus Blaine surveyed the small, hesitant group of Ravenclaws. He pondered for a moment before continuing. The number of people in a team doesn't have to be 3. 4 will do. No one moved. The young wizards exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of how to proceed. They had clearly picked up on the caution in Professor Blaine's words and were reluctant to make hasty decisions. Parvati Patil looked at the Ravenclaw team with disappointment. Her sister, Padma Patil, had not persisted, costing her the chance to form a team with her sibling. Harry and Hermione quickly stood together, leaving no doubt that they would team up. However, their team was missing one member. If Ron were present, they would be complete. Harry and Hermione exchanged a glance, feeling a momentary pang of disappointment. The Weasley twins, Fred and George, happily teamed up with their friend Lee Jordan. They were the first to form a complete team and eagerly awaited further instructions from Professor Blaine. Draco Malfoy hesitated, glancing behind him. He noticed Pansy Parkinson looking at him expectantly, but he didn't respond to her gaze. At that moment, he missed Crabbe and Goyle, who were the first to opt out of physical education class. Taking them along might have been a hindrance. Blaise Zabini and Theodore Knott avoided Draco's gaze, while Daphne Greengrass and Millicent Bulstrode had already decided to team up. Draco mumbled helplessly, "All right." He looked at Pansy with dissatisfaction and said slowly, "Then we're on the same team, Pansy, but if you pull what you did in Defense Against the Dark Arts last year." "Oh, I promise I won't," Pansy replied earnestly. "Who should we get as the third person? Draco, Crabbe, and Goyle aren't here." "I'm thinking about it," Draco replied impatiently. He considered choosing teammates from other houses, but the selection had to be from the Slytherin team. His eyes scanned the murmuring classmates, finally settling on Astoria Greengrass, who appeared slightly anxious. Astoria was the youngest in the Slytherin team, and no one wanted to choose someone who seemed weak in the face of the unknown. However, After she suggested using a badge to humiliate Granger, Astoria quickly produced a high-quality one, earning praise from Professor Blaine. Additionally, the Greengrass and Malfoy families had been friends for generations, and his father had often reminded him to look after the Greengrass sisters. "You join our team, Astoria," Draco commanded, ignoring Pansy's complaints and confusion. About 10 minutes later, most of the teams were formed. After some discussion, Harry and Hermione decided to include Ginny Weasley, who had been watching them expectantly, into their team. However, as the situation became clear, they noticed Neville Longbottom standing alone. This was both unexpected and understandable. Since they began practicing charms, Neville's confidence had plummeted. He struggled in both charms and transfiguration classes, and even Professor Blaine's innovative teaching methods couldn't help him overcome his difficulties. Neville realized he was a burden to others and stood there alone, his head bowed in sadness. When Hermione noticed, she immediately said, "Join us, Neville. We need one more person." Neville, who thought he was destined to be alone, looked at Hermione in disbelief, his eyes misty with emotion. "But I'll just cause trouble for you." "Stop being silly, Neville," Harry interjected, pulling Neville over with a smile. "That sword strike you made earlier was impressive. The only regret is that you should have aimed it directly at Malfoy's head." Neville grinned as their team finally came together. Harry turned around, casting an eager glance at Professor Blaine. However, his excitement quickly faded when he noticed Cedric Diggory successfully persuading Cho Chang to join his team. The smile on Harry's face froze, and it felt as if his insides had been hollowed out. How unseemly, Harry thought, glaring resentfully at Cedric. "It's still the same message," Professor Atticus Blaine said softly, smiling at the young, eager faces before him. "I hope you all have complete faith in your teammates and trust that they can protect your back in a life-and-death battle." The young wizards gradually quieted down. Although they couldn't fully grasp what Professor Blaine was implying, they sensed a special significance in his tone. "Now," Atticus clapped his hands, "everyone return to your seats. Our combat training will take place in my spiritual world. If I send a group of young wizards with missing limbs to the school hospital, Madame Pomfrey might either kill me or herself," he joked. The jest lightened the mood, and even Hermione momentarily forgot her lingering worries about the competition. Everyone was already familiar with the pure white spiritual world. After a brief moment of dizziness, the young wizards quickly regrouped with their teams, eager for what was to come. As before, "I need a team to demonstrate for everyone. Are there any volunteers?" Atticus asked with a smile as he approached the students. In Professor Blaine's class, caution was necessary, so not many responded immediately. However, the Weasley brothers and their friends eagerly raised their hands. "Then come on, your opponent will be me," Atticus announced. When Professor Blaine brought them into this spiritual world, the young wizards had anticipated this challenge. No one expected 3 or 4 young wizards to defeat Professor Blaine, but the chance to face the most powerful wizard of their time was a rare opportunity that made Fred and George's eyes gleam with excitement. "Let's get revenge, brother," Fred exclaimed. "Of course, we must show him our strength now," George replied, recalling the time when Professor Blaine had first arrived at Hogwarts and had bested them in the auditorium. "First, let me tell you," Atticus continued with a smile, "a duel means you might get injured or even die. In my spiritual world, death is obviously impossible, but to ensure the authenticity of the duel drill, you will experience a certain degree of pain feedback from injuries. So, be mentally prepared." End of this chapter. Chapter 583, The Pain That Shatters Illusions. The young wizards gathered in a tight circle, their eyes fixed on Professor Atticus Blaine, the Weasley twins, and Lee Jordan. Anticipation crackled in the air as they awaited the duel. Yet, Professor Blaine seemed to be taking his time, his speech somewhat long-winded. "I will restrain my power to a reasonable extent and refrain from using any extraordinary means. However, I will lift certain restrictions. For instance, while teleportation is not typically allowed on the Hogwarts grounds, I will employ apparition in this duel. Be mentally prepared for that," he explained. Harry grimaced at the memory of his apparition experience with Professor Blaine last summer. It had been far from pleasant. Hermione and Cedric, eyes wide with curiosity, focused intently on Professor Blaine. They were in a critical phase of their education, and any new knowledge could prove invaluable. Some of the younger wizards, unfamiliar with apparition, had finally grasped its nature after some inquiries. Their anticipation for the duel only grew. Observing the three young wizards who were still laughing and joking, Atticus Blaine pursed his lips and spoke patiently. "Prepare yourselves mentally. This is a real duel. I won't be as friendly as you might expect. Some events may defy your imagination." "Bring it on, Professor. We're ready," Fred declared with a grin. "Very well," Atticus sighed, realizing that no amount of words could match the impact of reality. After instructing the surrounding students to step back, remain silent, and avoid interfering, he calmly announced, "You may begin." Contrary to Atticus's expectations, the trio did not launch an immediate attack. Instead, they stood in a line, wands at the ready, scrutinizing him. "Where should we start?" Lee Jordan asked George, weighing his wand with interest. "Let me think," George replied, twisting his neck. The impassive demeanor of Professor Blaine did not intimidate him. "What's the most entertaining spell?" Everyone anticipated that, despite Professor Blaine's promise to restrain his abilities, the duel would conclude swiftly. However, the unfolding scene defied all expectations. Snap! A soft, unexpected sound reached the ears of the three young wizards. Suddenly, Professor Blaine, who had been standing several feet away, vanished. This abrupt change left them momentarily bewildered. Before they could comprehend the situation, a sharp whistle from behind sent a chill down their spines. Their training kicked in, and in an instant, Fred, George, and Lee Jordan realized the attack was coming from behind. They attempted to dodge, but their hesitation cost them the best chance to escape. Whoosh! Fred and Lee Jordan lunged forward, narrowly avoiding the attack. They were fortunate, as Professor Blaine's initial target was George Weasley. A piercing, agonized scream echoed through Atticus's mental space. Fred and Lee Jordan, having rolled to safety, turned back to witness an unforgettable sight. A 2-foot-long stone spike had impaled George's thigh, pinning him to the ground. Blood flowed from the wound, staining the pristine white world around them. At that moment, the spectators felt as if a bucket of icy water had been dumped over their heads, chilling them to the bone. The atmosphere was tense, sending shivers down the spines of everyone present. Many young wizards wanted to scream, but fear gripped them like a pair of strong hands around their throats, rendering them silent. "What are you doing?" Fred shouted angrily. He and Lee were about to rush to George, who would have fainted if not for his dulled sense of pain. At that moment, Professor Blaine raised his wand again, and a gray light emerged from its tip. It sliced through the air, transforming into a sharp crescent that spun rapidly toward Fred and Lee. Boom! Instinctively, Fred and Lee dodged, but in their haste, they moved in opposite directions, one to the left, the other to the right. Their foreheads collided with a sickening thud. The force of their Khaleesi on was so intense that neither made a sound as they crumpled to the ground, unconscious. A sneer played on the corner of Atticus Blaine's mouth. With a wave of his hand, the stone thorns binding George's legs vanished. Then, he and his two teammates disappeared without a trace. "3 have fallen by my hand," Atticus declared, turning slowly to face the silent young wizards. His gaze was cold and indifferent, and everyone lowered their heads, avoiding his eyes. "I trust none of you believe that dueling is merely an amusing skill for boasting, correct?" Professor Blaine's classes were never easy. Every young wizard who had made it this far had endured significant hardship. Yet, after surviving the initial trials, most were determined to persevere. The new changes in physical education classes at the start of the school year had only bolstered their resolve. But tonight, the thought of quitting crept back into their minds. A real duel is not a spectacle of beauty, but a brutal reality. Although George had left, perhaps as a lesson from Professor Blaine, the pool of blood he left behind on the pristine floor was a stark reminder of the harsh truth, stinging everyone's eyes. When faced with danger, with a life-and-death struggle, pain is the least of your concerns. Professor Blaine's voice was as chilling as ice, causing the young wizards to shiver. You may lose loved ones and friends at any moment. You will face despair. You will face death. Do not expect miracles in such situations. His words were as unyielding as iron, Caution, courage, the will to survive, teamwork, and honed skills. Only these can help you defeat your enemy and grasp the chance of survival. Suddenly, a stifled sob broke the silence. Despite his confusion, Harry instinctively turned toward the sound. It was Cho Chang, covering her mouth as tears of fear streamed down her face. Lee opened his mouth to speak, but seeing Cedric, who stood close to Cho, remain silent, he closed it again. There was no room for surrender. They had to endure. Hermione finally lifted her head, staring blankly at Professor Blaine. She had never found him so terrifying before. His method of teaching young wizards seemed to defy the rules and even the law, yet Hermione couldn't voice any objections. She understood that Professor Blaine was imparting real knowledge, skills that would truly help them survive in times of danger. Prudence, courage, the will to survive, teamwork, skills. Hermione silently repeated the key points emphasized by Professor Blaine. A surge of inexplicable power welled up from the depths of her heart, dispelling the fear that the Triwizard Tournament had instilled in her. Atticus Blaine, who was keenly attuned to the mental projections of those around him, noticed the change in Hermione. He paused in front of her, his expression remaining indifferent. Tonight, each team must face a test. Now, Hermione Granger, Harry Potter, Neville Longbottom, and Ginny Weasley, it's your turn to step forward. End of this chapter. Chapter 584, Harry's Dual Talent. Normally, Draco would have been thrilled to see Potter in trouble, and the Hufflepuffs would have relished Hermione Granger sharing their limelight. However, the recent incident where Professor Atticus Blaine broke George's leg was so shocking that it left everyone in a state of apprehension. The thought of being the next target quelled any sense of amusement. The circle of young wizards widened, wary of being splattered with Potter's or anyone else's blood. Hermione, Harry, Ginny, and Neville stepped forward, their faces pale as they endured Professor Blaine's intense gaze. They struggled to comprehend the aura of murderous intent that seemed to emanate from him. No one, not even Hermione and Harry, expected them to perform well. Before being summoned by Professor Blaine, Hermione had felt a shift in her resolve. Yet standing before him, her usually sharp mind seemed to falter. She tried to recall what Professor Blaine was doing there, but found little that could aid her. "What should we do?" Harry whispered, his voice strained. Hermione had no answer, but Professor Blaine spoke calmly. "So, are you ready?" Cold sweat trickled down Neville's temples. He gripped his wand tightly, ironically holding it with both hands as if it were a sword due to his nerves. Hermione, Harry, and Ginny remained silent, their lips pressed together as they watched Professor Blaine's hands, ready to dodge at the slightest movement. Observing the four young wizards lined up, Atticus sighed softly. "Why, aren't you going to learn from the previous group's mistakes?" Hermione's eyes widened in confusion, but Harry suddenly exclaimed, "Wait, Professor! We need to make arrangements." "You have only 2 minutes," Professor Blaine replied with a slight smile, turning his back to them, as if uninterested in overhearing their strategy. "Listen," Harry said urgently, gathering his teammates. His face was pale, and his breathing quickened. "We can't just stand there like before, or we'll end up like George." "What should we do then?" Neville asked nervously, swallowing hard. Harry frowned, glancing at Professor Blaine, who stood with his back to them. Thoughts raced through his mind, reminiscent of his first Quidditch practice, driven purely by instinct. "We can't take on Professor Blaine directly, even if he promises not to use powerful magic, so we need to be on the defensive." Harry's green eyes flickered as he looked at his friends. "Professor Blaine can apparate and might attack from any direction. We must be ready to defend from all sides." He turned to Hermione. "We need to face Professor Blaine head-on. Ginny and Neville, you cover our backs." The plan was straightforward. Hermione, Ginny, and Neville quickly nodded in agreement. Typically, Hermione was the strategist, but in this moment, Harry naturally assumed the role and took charge. Professor Blaine once mentioned the importance of attack rhythm, Harry recalled. "We can't all attack at once. It's a waste of energy. When I attack, Professor Blaine will dodge. Hermione, you focus on where he dodges and strike there." With this strategy in mind, they prepared to face the formidable Professor Blaine. The situation required the unspoken understanding that Professor Blaine had just mentioned. Both Hermione and Ginny grasped it immediately, but Neville hesitated. It wasn't a lack of comprehension. Rather, it was a lack of confidence in his magical abilities. Talent alone couldn't replace the need for learning. Harry, racking his brains, offered some suggestions, but beyond that, the rest could only be learned through real combat. 2 minutes seemed to pass in the blink of an eye. Professor Blaine turned around to see the 4 students standing in a square formation. Harry and Hermione faced him with nervous anticipation, while Neville and Ginny had their backs turned. A flicker of appreciation crossed his eyes, quickly replaced by a hint of sarcasm at the corner of his mouth. "Shall we begin?" he asked. "Ready, Professor?" Harry Repley, Ed, his voice high-pitched with excitement. The young wizards observing the duel took a collective step back, and Draco watched Harry's preparations with a glimmer of envy in his eyes. It was an obvious strategy, but without a reminder, he hadn't considered it. Just like in Quidditch, Potter's dueling talent was remarkable. With a swift motion, Professor Blaine initiated the attack. This time, he didn't teleport to another position. Instead, he squinted, raised his hand, and sent forth a black shadow, a stone spike that had been targeting George's thigh. His silent spell and precise movements were astonishingly fast. In the blink of an eye, the stone spike hurtled through the air, aiming for Hermione's shoulder blade with a terrifying scream. Thanks to her extensive training, Hermione reacted swiftly. Weighing her options between dodging and defending, she raised her wrist and conjured an iron armor barrier. The stone spike was halted 20 feet away from her with a resounding boom. The powerful surge of magic made Hermione stumble backward, her vision momentarily blurred. Yet a hint of triumph graced her face, as the scattered gravel proved she had successfully blocked Professor Blaine's attack. The young wizards watching were invigorated by Hermione's success, realizing they weren't as vulnerable as they feared. However, what followed was a harsh lesson in the relentless nature of combat. With a deft flick of his wrist, Professor Blaine transformed the scattered gravel into hundreds of stone nails. They twisted in midair and then shot towards Harry with a sharp, whistling sound. The attack covered every possible escape route, leaving Harry no choice but to defend. With no time to spare, Harry erected a barrier to shield himself from the barrage of stone nails, as dense as a rainstorm. But Professor Blaine wasn't idle. After restraining Harry, he vanished, reappearing behind Neville and Ginny. They heard the commotion but dared not turn around, adhering to Harry's earlier instructions to guard their rear. Neville, in particular, fought the urge to look back, his eyes wide with determination. Suddenly, a cold face appeared inches from Neville's own, startling him. "Ah!" he screamed, recoiling in fear. He tried to move, but Professor Blaine seized his wand. A rope shot from the tip, binding Neville tightly and sending him crashing to the ground. To her credit, Ginny reacted swiftly, but the situation was dire. Upon realizing that Neville had been attacked, she cast her spell almost instantaneously. A swarm of bats erupted from the tip of her staff, but Professor Blaine seemed to have anticipated this move. He stood in front of Neville for barely half a second before swiftly sidestepping the torrent. Seizing the moment of Ginny's brief vulnerability after casting her spell, he slid to the side and grasped her by the throat. The intense sensation of suffocation caused Ginny's eyes to roll back and her body convulsed. At that moment, Harry and Hermione finally regained their composure. Neville's agonized groan as he collapsed to the ground prompted them to abandon their defensive stance and turn around. "Stop!" Harry shouted angrily, witnessing Ginny's distress. Yet, Professor Blaine did not relent. Instead, he pointed his wand menacingly at Ginny's eyes, offering a cruel and cold smile. "Drop your wands now," Atticus Blaine commanded icily, tightening his grip. Ginny's body writhed like a fish out of water, gasping for air, causing Harry and Hermione to shudder with fear. Without hesitation, they dropped their wands. However, surrendering meant certain doom without hope of rescue. 2 beams of red light shot forth like icy lightning, and both Harry and Hermione's eyes rolled back as they collapsed limply to the ground. It had been less than 10 seconds since Professor Blaine had launched his attack. End of this chapter. Chapter 585, Humiliation in Line. Huff! Huff! With 2 more sharp, stunning spells, Neville and Ginny followed in the footsteps of Harry and Hermione, disappearing into Professor Atticus Blaine's mental space. The scene was particularly harrowing for Ginny, as Professor Blaine nearly pressed his wand against her face before casting the spell. This cruel and ruthless act left everyone in shock. There was no need to elaborate on Professor Blaine's power. Few at Hogwarts dared to challenge his authority. The young wizards had never witnessed such a terrifying side of him before. Compared to Professor Blaine, the stern faces of Professors Snape and McGonagall seemed almost gentle. No one questioned the legality or reasonableness of a professor treating students this way. They were all too concerned about their own fates. Trapped in Professor Blaine's spiritual world, they had no choice at all. Now, I will give you 2 more minutes to think about why the previous group lost, Professor Blaine announced, not immediately calling the next group to the stage, but instead offering a brief respite. Reasons for failure? What was there to think about? Potter and his friends were simply no match for him, some young wizards thought silently. Professor Blaine faced them, as if expecting someone to provide an answer. It's Longbottom? Slytherin's Millicent tentatively raised her hand, her voice uncharacteristically meek. He's the one holding the team back. I mean, he didn't even use a single spell. Is there any other answer? Professor Blaine asked, his face betraying no emotion. After a moment of suffocating silence, Draco mustered the courage to speak, gritting his teeth. They should be more flexible. They shouldn't just stand around like targets. They should. Draco hesitated, struggling to articulate his thoughts. After you attacked Granger, Potter should have seized the opportunity to counterattack. They shouldn't have waited for you to launch a second attack. They should have reacted faster. Cedric offered his own insights, adding to the discussion. The atmosphere became a bit more lively as students from each house shared their opinions. Some were reasonable, while others were nonsensical. However, Professor Blaine neither confirmed nor dismissed any of the opinions, listening quietly to each one. You need to think for yourselves, Professor Blaine said slowly when the room fell silent again. You are not machines. You have your own thoughts and your own style, which will eventually lead to your unique way of fighting. Don't expect me to spoon-feed you the correct answers. Next, 3 brave Gryffindor girls were called to the stage. Angelina Johnson, Alicia Spinnet, and Katie Bell. To be honest, they surprised Professor Blaine. Perhaps it was because these 3 had worked together on the Quidditch field for so long, developing an understanding of formations beyond the ordinary. Their teamwork was commendable. After learning from the failures of the Weasley brothers and Granger's group, they at least understood that in a duel, attack and defense are 2 formations that can be quickly switched, rather than simply standing there foolishly. However, while they were aware of this, they struggled to switch smoothly, allowing Professor Blaine to exploit their flaw. He trapped Angelina in a swamp, and the sudden change left Katie and Alicia momentarily stunned. They quickly thought of ways to rescue Angelina, but this was undoubtedly, it was a grave mistake. They failed to realize the necessity of leaving one person behind to handle the next attack from Atticus Blaine. Instead of doing this, they might as well have sacrificed Angelina. Immediately afterward, a ball of purple magical fire surged toward them, and with a piercing scream, the 3 vanished simultaneously. Hufflepuff's team followed closely, though they were somewhat slow to adapt. Most of their members repeated the errors of those who had gone before them. The only standout was Cedric Diggory. He was the first young wizard to bravely take the lead in attacking upon entering the field. A swift, crushing curse forced Professor Blaine to dodge sideways, and Cedric accurately predicted the direction of his dodge. The subsequent disarming curse prompted Professor Blaine to wave his wand for the first time, dispersing the light of the curse. Of course, Cedric's mistakes were as glaring as his successes. When Professor Blaine appeared beside Cho Chang, Cedric suddenly panicked. He seemed to believe that Cho Chang was destined to suffer harm, so he turned and threw her to the ground in an attempt to shield her. This foolish act shocked his teammate Roger, who then watched as Cedric and Cho Chang, tangled together, were impaled by a stone spear. Roger himself was also sent flying by an explosion. The Ravenclaw girls' performance was neither remarkable nor foolish. It was Luna's perpetually distracted demeanor that made Atticus purse his lips. Her greatest strength and weakness stemmed from her exceptional magical perception. Draco's team was the first Slytherin group to take the stage, and they were also the last team to participate in the test that night, which surprised Atticus. So many teams had failed and left, but at least Draco understood one crucial lesson: strike first to gain the upper hand. The moment Professor Blaine announced the start, Draco immediately unleashed his special move. 2 black pythons, as thick as his wrists and 5 or 6 feet long, shot from the tip of his staff. One coiled protectively around him, while the other darted forward with incredible speed and an unpredictable trajectory, appearing before Professor Blaine in the blink of an eye. The black python's belly bounced off the ground, springing up like a tightly compressed coil. It opened its menacing mouth mid-air, revealing sharp fangs, and lunged straight for Professor Blaine's face. Such a fierce and relentless attack brought a slight smile to Atticus's lips. He raised his wand, dispersing the black python into wisps of smoke, and countered Draco's assault with a corrosive spell. As the blue curse, filled with the breath of death, was about to strike Draco, the remaining black python leaped up, swallowed Professor Blaine's curse, and then fell to the ground, twitching in agony. Simultaneously, Astoria Greengrass, the youngest daughter of the Greengrass family, completed her attack magic. "Ovis!" she cried, and hundreds of birds materialized before her. Each bird's beak glinted with a cold metallic sheen. They spread their wings and chirped loudly. Before Professor Blaine's counterspell could land, the birds had already surrounded him. The timing of this coordinated attack was enough to overwhelm most adult wizards, and even Atticus's eyes showed a hint of admiration. However, expecting this single maneuver to defeat Atticus, who maintained the strength of an elite auror, was unrealistic. Faced with hundreds of birds encircling him, Atticus's fallen arm swiftly rose again, and there was no hesitation in his response. A sudden, inexplicable force swept through the area, causing the birds summoned by Astoria to plummet to the ground as if subjected to intense gravity. Before Professor Blaine could address the falling birds, Draco's team had already anticipated that such a simple attack wouldn't bring him down. They formed a triangle and charged forward with determination. Once the birds obstructing his view were dealt with, Atticus Blaine unexpectedly found himself being swiftly surrounded. This impressive maneuver made him abandon the idea of disapparating to escape. Instead, he stood his ground, waiting for the 3 young wizards to position themselves to his satisfaction. What followed was a barrage of attacks. However, perhaps due to their eagerness for success, their attack rhythm faltered compared to their initial coordination. Encouragingly, Atticus maneuvered through their positions and barriers, remaining on the defensive and allowing the young wizards to take the initiative. This wave of offensive lasted for over a minute until suddenly, Astoria's face turned pale. As the light of her disarming curse burst into starlight, a strong sense of dizziness overwhelmed her, causing her to collapse. This unexpected turn of events made Draco's heart skip a beat. Instinctively, he and Pansy ceased their attacks. Soon, the same dizziness and nausea overcame them, making it difficult to stand. Both covered their heads, staggering. As Professor Blaine approached with a smile, Draco resisted the urge to flee and asked in horror, "When did you poison us?" "Oh, I didn't poison you at all," Atticus replied with a smile. "You simply haven't fully considered the limits of your own abilities. Maintaining high-intensity attack suppression consumes a lot of magical power and physical strength, Mr. Malfoy." After 3 painful cries, Draco's team vanished from Atticus Blaine's spiritual world. End of this chapter. Chapter 586, Untitled. When the last 3 members of the Slytherin team leaped from their stools, roaring in terror, Professor Blaine slowly opened his eyes, surveying the young wizards before him. George Weasley, still shaken by the recent events, sat clutching his unharmed thigh. His usual humor seemed to have vanished, replaced by a look of profound sadness as he gazed at Professor Blaine. Neville hung his head, looking apologetic, while Hermione, Harry, and Ginny whispered words of comfort to him. Meanwhile, Draco was proudly recounting their encounter with Professor Blaine to those around him. Most of the young wizards wore expressions of numbness. The ferocity of Professor Blaine's earlier attack had been beyond their capacity to endure. Despite their extensive training, which had led them to believe in their potential, they were effortlessly defeated by Professor Blaine, who had restrained most of his power. The resulting sense of loss was indescribable. Observing the disheartened students, Atticus Blaine was not particularly disappointed. The outcome had been anticipated. "Cheer up," Professor Blaine said calmly. As the student eyes turned towards him, he raised his wand to his temple, drawing out several strands of silver threads that shimmered with a halo. "Now, let's review the drill from start to finish." With a flick of his wand, the silver threads unraveled into a plane, resembling rippling water waves. The perspective was from Professor Blaine himself. Fred, George, and Lee had been dispatched in the first wave, and the subsequent performance of the young wizards, including Hermione, remained unknown to them. No one was surprised by Professor Blaine's remarkable methods. They had grown accustomed to them. Everyone watched their earlier performance in silence. The remainder of the class was spent reviewing the duel, and with only a few minutes left, they watched the entire encounter from start to finish. "You have generally fallen into a misconception," Professor Blaine addressed the contemplative students. "You treated the duel as just another classroom exercise, failing to approach it with the seriousness it required. This mindset is extremely dangerous. If you become accustomed to this mentality, when you eventually face a real opponent on the battlefield, you'll find there's no opportunity for a do-over. By then, it will be too late." The issues revealed in the duel extended beyond this. Setting aside the individual abilities of the young wizards, from Professor Blaine's perspective, their teamwork was lacking. Even Draco's group only managed to synchronize their attack rhythm, while the attacks themselves were disjointed. However, considering it was their first attempt at cooperation and their first real attack on someone, these mistakes were understandable. As for the specific reasons for each group's failure, I won't tell you, Professor Blaine continued. You need to reflect on it. Each group must submit a paper discussing the reasons for their failure by next Wednesday. The paper should be no less than 15 inches long. A 15-inch paper was no small task. Harry's eyes twitched at the thought, but he quickly realized that Professor Blaine's assignment was for groups, meaning the workload could be shared. With Hermione's diligence, she could likely complete the paper on her own. The atmosphere at the end of the class was unusually somber. The students lined up to leave the classroom, with George still limping. Though physically uninjured, the mental blow had been profound, effects of the day's events on her body. She couldn't shake off the illusion that lingered in her mind. "Oh, yes," Harry muttered, trying to ignore the smug glances Malfoy kept throwing his way. Malfoy had been fortunate, learning from the mistakes of previous teams. If Slytherin had been the first to take the field, he might have fared worse than George. "Too bad," Harry whispered to himself as he was about to leave the classroom. He hesitated, then turned back, heading towards Professor Blaine, who was orchestrating the tables and chairs to return to their places with a flick of his wand. A few minutes later, Harry emerged from the classroom, a mix of laughter and tears in his eyes, clutching a signed note from Professor Blaine. "Are you going to?" Hermione was waiting for him outside the door. She took one look at him and understood. "He gave it to you?" "Professor Blaine has always been approachable, hasn't he?" Harry asked, a hint of surprise in his voice. "Yes," Hermione replied, her lips pursed, eyes wide with fear, her body trembling slightly. "But when he cast that spell on Ginny in the spiritual world, Ginny will definitely have nightmares tonight." "Ginny's not the only one who'll have nightmares," Harry said somberly, stepping forward. Typically, students returning from physical education classes were buzzing with excitement, eager to share their experiences, unless Professor Blaine had instructed them to keep the lesson confidential. However, today's events left everyone feeling uneasy. "What happened?" Ron was waiting for them in front of the fat lady's portrait, looking anxious. As soon as he saw them, he rushed over. "Didn't you go to class? Why does George look like he's been hurt? I've never seen Ginny like that before. What happened? Why won't anyone talk?" Ron glanced at Hermione, but when he saw the turmoil in her eyes, he quickly turned his gaze to Harry. "Oh, it's nothing," Harry said warily. "Nothing unexpected happened, Ron. We just got a lesson from Professor Blaine. We'll talk about it inside. Hermione and I were hit by a coma spell in Professor Blaine's spiritual world, but it felt real." With that, Harry moved past Ron towards the portrait of the fat lady, Hermione following silently. Watching them leave, Ron opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. His face looked particularly pale in the firelight. As the sun set in the west, its blood-red glow cast a haunting light over the rugged surface of the Black Lake. The majestic black castle stood silently on the cliff, watching the rippling waves, exuding a silent, inexplicable tragedy. Fleur Delacour didn't care for such melancholy scenes, so she turned her gaze away. Looking towards the nearby Quidditch pitch, she spotted Hermione Granger, the young girl who shared her status as a champion, running laps around the field alongside more than a dozen others. It seemed so foolish to her. From her first day at Hogwarts, Fleur had noticed this peculiar habit. Every evening, a group of students would run around the stadium, seemingly oblivious to the magical alternatives available to them. This behavior struck Fleur as so absurd that she couldn't even muster the curiosity to investigate further. In her temporary living quarters, draped with sky-blue curtains and filled with a refreshing fragrance, every decoration was meticulously crafted, exuding an artistic atmosphere. Fleur, dressed in blue silk pajamas, lay lazily on her side on the bed, too indifferent to address the day's lingering effects. One of her shoulder straps had slipped off, leaving the lower half of her body uncovered. She turned over and glanced around her room with a sense of boredom. On the dressing table, a radio encased in the horn of some magical creature was playing music by the Weird Sisters, harsh and unpleasant, as Fleur described it. Vulgar, completely unaesthetic British people, she muttered angrily. Everything at Hogwarts was different from what she had anticipated. She had expected a warm welcome, but instead found herself feeling left out. Moreover, the Triwizard Tournament had also encountered an unexpected incident. Elder sister. Gabrielle entered the room, the only one allowed to do so without permission. Oh, Gabrielle. Fleur adjusted her shoulder strap and sat up slightly. Please help me get rid of that radio. I've had enough of this dreadful music. I think it's quite interesting, Gabrielle replied with a smile as she turned off the music. She had come to call Fleur for dinner. The person in charge of the castle just spoke we, the Madame Maxime. He hopes we won't stay in the carriage, but join everyone in the Great Hall for dinner. The person in charge of the castle? Fleur's heart skipped a beat. Who is it? When she was with her sister, Gabrielle was an eccentric little girl. She knew exactly what answer her sister wanted, but she smiled and remained silent until Fleur pulled her closer and tickled her under her arm. Gabrielle giggled and finally said, It's Mr. Blaine. He told Madame Maxime that the Triwizard Tournament is meant to promote communication between all parties. If we and the Durmstrang students always stay in our own places, then the event loses its meaning. So, Madame Maxime agreed. Did he say anything else? Fleur asked, her hair cascading as she looked at Gabrielle expectantly. No, Gabrielle replied honestly. It wasn't until her sister's interest waned that Gabrielle, eager to take credit, added, But I told Mr. Blaine that I wanted to visit Hogsmeade, the only pure wizarding village in the UK, and Mr. Blaine immediately agreed. End of this chapter. Chapter 587, Meeting with Sirius. Sirius had arranged for them to meet at the Three Broomsticks pub at noon on Saturday. For most of the morning, Atticus Blaine found himself idly writing his potions paper in the common room. Hermione, on the other hand, remained secluded in the dormitory. Ever since she had been alerted to the dangers of some Triwizard Tournament events by Crumb, she had become intensely focused. She had borrowed a weighty tome from the library, and Hagrid was inundated with books as she delved into the habits of dangerous creatures and their countermeasures. She studied these books tirelessly, and any interruption was met with a sharp temper. Meanwhile, Ron had borrowed the firebolt early in the morning and headed to the field with Dean and Seamus for some much-needed freedom. When Atticus reminded him about their plan to go to Hogsmeade through the secret passage later, Ron hesitated. After a moment's thought, he declined the offer again. Meeting Sirius was the highlight Atticus had been eagerly anticipating since receiving the reply, and Ron's absence left him feeling disappointed. Even without Hermione's guidance, Atticus was beginning to sense a significant change in his close friend of several years. He realized that Ron's concerns might not be solely about Hermione, as she suggested, but perhaps there was a deeper reason he had yet to uncover. "Sorry, am I late?" Atticus found himself alone in the common room, unable to find any familiar girls to fetch Hermione from the dormitory. He waited anxiously until, with only 10 minutes to spare before 11 o'clock, Hermione rushed down the stairs, her hair in disarray. As she approached, Atticus exclaimed in surprise, "Hermione, what happened to your face?" He pointed to the scratches on her cheeks. "Did you throw Crookshank's latest catch out the window again?" "Let's talk as we go, Atticus," Hermione replied, her attire slightly disheveled. They hurriedly left Gryffindor Tower, and once they reached a deserted corner, Atticus pulled out his invisibility cloak from his bag, draping it over both of them. Though he had used the cloak countless times, wearing it in the castle during the day was a novel experience. To avoid the bustling crowds, far more numerous than at night, they had to be exceptionally cautious. Otherwise, upon their return from Hogsmeade, rumors of hauntings in the castle would spread like wildfire. They reached the Gunhilda corridor on the 3rd floor, a remote area devoid of people. Atticus removed the invisibility cloak, and Hermione dashed to the hunchbacked one-eyed witch sculpture at the end. They waited until the hunchback opened, and then both quickly climbed through. "I'm practicing how to deal with dementors in the dormitory," Hermione confessed as they sprinted through the secret passage, their wands illuminating the way. Her voice was tinged with frustration. "I can't use the Patronus charm. No matter how much I recite the spell, nothing happens. This has never happened before. How did you manage it, Atticus? How did Professor Lupin teach you?" "There's a trick to it," Atticus replied, a sense of pride in mastering a spell that eluded Hermione. "You need a boggart to practice with. It's incredibly helpful for learning this magic." "Atticus?" Hermione said helplessly. "I'm not you. Boggarts don't turn into dementors for me. Besides, boggarts aren't something you can just pick up at Honeydukes for a few galleons." "Oh, I forgot," Atticus admitted sheepishly, a little embarrassing. Hermione admitted, "But you have to focus on recalling those happy memories. The stronger they are, the better your chances of successfully casting the spell." Her voice wavered slightly. "You must have noticed that when I close my eyes now, all I see are happy memories, not dementors, werewolves, vampires, or anything like that." Harry found himself at a loss for words. Even with the secret passage, the journey from Hogwarts to Hogsmeade was no short trek. He remembered how, last school year, the trip through the passage always felt long and dark. Yet now, as they ran, the physical exertion seemed less daunting. Harry realized more than ever the value of good physical health for a wizard. Before they entered the secret passage, the sun, hidden behind thin clouds, cast a faint light on the earth. But when Harry and Hermione emerged from the storeroom of Honeyduke's sweet shop, they were surprised to find the sky had darkened and a gentle rain was falling. "Come on, Harry. We can't let those girls see us. They're from Beauxbatons," Hermione urged. When Hogwarts wasn't in session, only local children from Hogsmeade visited Honeydukes, but Hermione had spotted a few tall young girls behind the shelves. The candies seemed to lift their spirits more than anything at Hogwarts. How did they get out? Harry wondered aloud as he ducked and followed Hermione out of the shop. On the street, they noticed several young men and women whose style was distinctly different from the local villagers. "They're guests, aren't they?" Hermione remarked, unfazed. "There's always a bit of privilege. Harry, take out the invisibility cloak and put it on. I'm afraid there are more of them in the 3 broomsticks. I spotted some Durmstrang students." Hermione's hunch was right. When they reached the 3 broomsticks, they found a group of Durmstrang students gathered there, clearly more interested in alcohol than sweets. They crowded around the bar, demanding the strongest liquor, much to Mrs. Rosmerta's exasperation. Harry scanned the room, but didn't see Crumb, perhaps because he wanted to avoid causing a scene. Under the invisibility cloak, Harry and Hermione searched the pub until they spotted Sirius sitting inconspicuously at a table. He held a glass of beer, eyeing the Durmstrang students with a hint of disdain. Sirius. Harry's heart leaped with joy at the sight of his godfather. He instinctively moved to remove the cloak and greet him, but Hermione quickly stopped him. "We can't show ourselves, Harry," she whispered urgently. "We snuck out." Sirius, more perceptive than expected, sensed their presence immediately. His expression sharpened momentarily before softening into a smile. "Ah, Harry and Hermione, you've brought out James' invisibility cloak. A wise choice." "How did you know it was us, Sirius?" Hermione asked, surprised, as Harry guided her to sit on the stools Sirius had pulled close. "You still have much to learn," Sirius chuckled, pointing to the floor. Harry and Hermione turned to see two sets of footprints leading from the door to their spot, unmistakably belonging to a boy and a girl. "Oh, that's how," Hermione realized, a smile tugging at her lips. "Hermione," Atticus Blaine said appreciatively, "that was clever." "How are you doing, Sirius?" Harry asked happily, leaning against the edge of the table. Sirius looked much like he did when he picked Harry up from the Dursleys during the summer break. He appeared weathered and had lost a bit of weight, but his spirits seemed high. Although Sirius couldn't see Harry's expression, he could tell from Harry's tone that he was likely grinning. Sirius knew he had to be discreet, lest bystanders think he was acting oddly. "There's no other word for it besides enriching, Harry," Sirius said, raising his wineglass to hide his smile. "And you, Harry, how are things going?" "Everything's going well," Harry whispered. It had been 2 months since the school year began, and so far, he hadn't encountered any major trouble, a first in several years. "So, Hermione," Sirius said, staring at the beer swirling in his glass, pretending to ponder, "I'm afraid your recent situation hasn't been as pleasant, has it?" End of this chapter. Chapter 588, The Repentant Death Eater. Compared to Harry, Hermione's relationship with Sirius wasn't as close. However, during the summer vacation, they had spent some time together at the Weasley house. Given Harry's deep connection with Sirius, Hermione considered him a trustworthy friend and a respected elder in the wizarding world, especially since she was born a Muggle. She confided in him about the pressures she was facing and the strange looks she received from others. As she spoke, her shoulders began to tremble slightly. Harry, hidden under the invisibility cloak beside her, listened silently, feeling a surge of anger. He understood all too well what Hermione was going through, having faced similar challenges himself. "I see," Sirius said softly when Hermione finished her tale. "I understand the feeling of being misunderstood better than anyone else, Hermione. It's incredibly painful, but no matter what, as long as you persist, you'll always find hope. You can't let those who persecute you succeed." Hermione wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes and looked at Sirius in surprise. She realized that her grievances were minor compared to what Sirius had endured. Wrongly accused of betraying Harry's parents, he had been imprisoned in Azkaban for 12 years. He chose to escape to catch the real murderer, risking his life along the way. As he said, with the help of some, he eventually cleared his name and was accepted by the community. "Thank you, Sirius," Hermione said, her voice filled with gratitude. "Do you have any ideas, Sirius?" Harry asked eagerly. "I'm not sure," Sirius sighed heavily. "I do have some thoughts, but since Atticus Blaine and Dumbledore have chosen to remain silent." Sirius's words were puzzling. Harry and Hermione didn't quite grasp what he was trying to convey. Realizing he shouldn't show too much concern in front of the two young wizards, Sirius composed himself and said seriously, "Hermione, I need you to tell me everything that happened after you were selected as a champion. This will help me make an accurate judgment." Hermione had already recounted the argument in the room behind the Great Hall to Harry, Ron, and Ginny. As she revisited the events, she felt the same emotions she had experienced then, though not as intensely. Her heart still raced. "Barty Crouch finally confirmed my status as a champion. He told the headmasters of Durmstrang and Beauxbatons that if they felt it was unfair, the score at Hogwarts would be averaged between me and Cedric Diggory, and that would be the end of it." Hermione spoke in a hushed voice, careful not to be overheard in the bustling bar. Her narration was intermittent, taking about a quarter of an hour to recount the events of that night. "How's it going?" Harry asked impatiently. "Did you find anything serious?" "Obviously," Sirius replied, deep in thought. His gray eyes occasionally flashed with sharp, rational light, a testament to his experience as an Auror. After 2 minutes, under the eager anticipation of Harry and Hermione, Sirius spoke in a deep voice. "The person who put your name in the goblet of fire, Hermione, was in that room that night." Hermione's fists clenched suddenly, and Harry was so incensed he nearly stood up from his stool. Fortunately, Hermione caught him in time. "How did you figure that out, Sirius?" Hermione asked, her voice slightly breathless with nerves. "Do you really need to ask?" Sirius smiled, his expression a mix of confidence and reassurance. "Atticus Blaine has already revealed the answer, hasn't he? Under normal circumstances, the Goblet of Fire would only select one Hogwarts champion. Yet, unexpectedly, both your name and Amos's son's name emerged from the goblet. This is certainly no accident, unless someone tampered with it. Those capable of such magic were all present in the room that night. The principals of the three schools, Professor Blaine, Professor McGonagall, Professor Snape, Professor Moody, 2 senior officials from the Ministry of Magic, and the 4 champions, all these faces flashed before Hermione's eyes. "I thought Professor Blaine was just trying to help me," Hermione began. "Clear your name?" Sirius interjected with a knowing smile, finishing Hermione's thought. "Adults aren't as straightforward as you might think, kids. In situations like that, everything said has a purpose. Of course, Atticus did partly aim to clear you of suspicion, but I believe he was also sending a message to the hidden culprit, warning them not to act rashly." "But who could it be?" Hermione asked urgently. Harry remained silent, but Sirius glanced at him knowingly. "I know who you're suspecting, Harry, but unfortunately, I don't think Snape is behind this." Anticipating Harry's protest, Sirius quickly added, "We all dislike that greasy-haired guy, Harry, but that's a separate issue. I know him, and this isn't his style. If he wanted to cause trouble for Hermione, he'd likely tamper with potion ingredients in class, then blame Hermione for breaking the rules." Harry huffed and fell silent. That evening, Sirius paused, deep in thought. Moody mentioned that whoever put your name into the Goblet of Fire either wanted to kill you or cause trouble for Hogwarts. He continued thoughtfully, "Hermione, did you notice who Moody was looking at when he said that?" "The headmaster of Durmstrang, Professor Karkaroff," Hermione recalled, her eyebrows raising in surprise. "Are you suggesting that Karkaroff put my name into the goblet? But why?" "Oh," Sirius took of his drink and shrugged. "It's not just me. Moody is clearly suspicious too. Don't underestimate Alastor Moody. Even though he's retired, he was a legendary Auror with an incredibly sharp intuition. He's more effective than Rufus Scrimgeour right now. But that night, Karkaroff kept insisting I shouldn't be a champion. He didn't seem—" Hermione hesitated. "If Karkaroff was the culprit, his acting skills were impeccable, and his motive couldn't be to harm her." Hermione knew she had never crossed paths with Karkaroff before. If his aim was to embarrass Hogwarts, why choose her among so many students? "If I were the culprit, I'd do everything to make it seem like I had nothing to do with it," Sirius said, curling his lips in disdain. "Hermione, those with hidden agendas are more cunning than you think, especially someone like Igor Karkaroff." "You know him?" Harry asked, surprised by the implication in Sirius's words. "Oh, Harry," Sirius's contempt deepened. "It's hard not to recognize Igor Karkaroff. He's more infamous than you realize, especially in Azkaban." Sirius glanced at the drunken Durmstrang students at the bar, his expression darkening. "I'll tell you both directly. Igor Karkaroff once served Voldemort. He's a Death Eater. There's no doubt about it. There is no need to doubt the authenticity of this matter. The evidence is clear, and he is a member of the Wizengamot. The Inquisition has personally confirmed this. The reason he wasn't imprisoned in Azkaban, like I was, is because he convincingly assured the Ministry of Magic that he had changed his ways. To atone for his past actions and secure his freedom, he revealed the names of many former colleagues, which directly led to their imprisonment in Azkaban." Sirius, noticing the surprise on the faces of the 2 young listeners beside him, took a sip of his beer and sneered, "Oh, I almost forgot to mention. It was Moody who arrested him back then." End of this chapter. Chapter 589. The headmaster of Durmstrang is a Death Eater, Hermione exclaimed, her eyes wide with disbelief. Harry slowly turned his gaze towards the Durmstrang students at the bar, who were loudly demanding more drinks from Mrs. Rosmerta. He thought of Crumb, who had always been friendly, and struggled to articulate his thoughts. How is this possible? How could the school allow— "Huh," Sirius scoffed. "There are many strange things in this world. To be honest, Karkaroff isn't exactly a brave man. I thought he'd never dare set foot in this country again. I didn't expect him to have the nerve to bring his students here for the tournament. During the Triwizard Tournament, he dared to appear in front of Moody and Crouch, but that was all. I bet if there were any rumors of his old master returning, he'd flee faster than anyone else. He must know that his past actions won't be forgiven. Sirius paused, then continued. This guy isn't magnanimous either, so he resents Dumbledore for stopping Voldemort, or perhaps Atticus Blaine for defeating him and making Hogwarts the host of the Triwizard Tournament as revenge. It's not impossible. Hermione still couldn't fathom that Krumm's headmaster had once served Voldemort, especially since he had helped them during the World Cup. Just a few days ago, Krumm had even given her advice on handling the competition. But Hermione bit her lower lip lightly. I don't understand. Even if Karkaroff is a Death Eater, why would he come to me? It doesn't make sense, does it? I've never met him before he came to Hogwarts. He can't just pick someone at random, right? Faced with this question, Sirius seemed uncertain. It was clear he had been pondering this for days. Yeah, if he had targeted Harry, it would be easier to understand. Harry's face darkened, as any topic related to Voldemort inevitably involved him. Unable to solve this mystery, Sirius looked a bit melancholic. He leaned back in his chair, staring silently at the ceiling, visibly worried. Harry followed this line of thought, frowning. What if Karkaroff had already heard of your name? Harry noticed Hermione's shocked expression and quickly explained. Krumm might have mentioned what happened at the World Cup to his headmaster when he returned to school. He could have told Karkaroff about helping you in the game box, so Karkaroff remembered. This theory wasn't impossible, but it seemed a bit far-fetched. Neither Hermione nor Sirius commented on it. Karkaroff being the culprit is just my opinion and Moody's. The truth might be different. After a long pause, Sirius said, glancing at Harry and Hermione with a hesitant expression. In fact, there's something you don't know. I'm not sure if I should share it because I promised to keep it absolutely confidential. Oh, come on, Sirius. We'll keep it a secret. Harry and Hermione exchanged glances, and Harry's curiosity was piqued. Okay, but you two must promise to keep it secret. Sirius leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Actually, the day after you were chosen as a champion, Hermione, I received a letter from Atticus Blaine. He asked me to keep a close eye on Barty Crouch. He wanted me to monitor some of his actions at the Ministry and ensure no one discovered them. Be Barty Crouch, Hermione stammered, stunned. Professor Blaine asked you to, Harry gasped. This revelation was completely unexpected for both Hermione and Harry. They never imagined that Professor Blaine would suspect Barty Crouch. If they had to choose, both Hermione and Harry would undoubtedly trust Professor Blaine's judgment. More developments than we initially thought. But Harry, you must be careful. The situation is more dangerous than it appears. Harry and Hermione exchanged worried glances. The weight of Sirius's words hung heavily in the air, adding to the already tense atmosphere of the Three Broomsticks pub. The chatter of the crowd seemed distant, as if they were in a bubble of their own concerns. Atticus Blaine, Sirius continued, is someone you should keep an eye on. His involvement in this whole affair is still unclear, but his connections run deep. He's not just any underage wizard. There's more to him than meets the eye. Hermione furrowed her brow, trying to piece together the puzzle. But why would someone like Barty Crouch be interested in Atticus Blaine? What could he possibly gain from involving him? Sirius sighed, his expression grave. That's the question, isn't it? The Ministry is a web of secrets and power plays. Crouch's motives are likely tied to something much larger than we can see right now. But remember, not everything is as it seems. Trust your instincts, but be cautious. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the windows and casting a gray hue over the village of Hogsmeade. The once vibrant colors of the landscape were muted, adding to the sense of foreboding that lingered in the room. As the conversation continued, Sirius shared more insights into the political intricacies of the wizarding world, the alliances and rivalries that shaped their reality. Harry listened intently, absorbing every detail, while Hermione took mental notes, her analytical mind working overtime. Despite the valuable information, Harry couldn't shake the feeling of disappointment. He had hoped for clear answers, a straightforward path to follow. Instead, he was left with more questions and a sense of unease about the challenges ahead. As they prepared to leave, Sirius placed a reassuring hand on Harry's shoulder. "Remember, you're not alone in this. You have friends who will stand by you, no matter what, and I'll always be here to help, whenever you need me." With those words, Harry and Hermione slipped back under the invisibility cloak, blending into the bustling crowd as they made their way out of the pub. The rain continued to fall, a constant reminder of the storm brewing both outside and within the world of magic. Rumors suggest that those posing as Death Eaters are actually hired, and behind them, there might be a genuine Death Eater pulling the strings. Sirius's statement starkly contrasted with the news released by the Ministry of Magic in the Daily Prophet, but determining which was more credible required little thought. Harry frowned, listening intently. There are numerous signs indicating that Death Eaters are becoming active again. Why would these cunning individuals, who have been lurking in the shadows for over a decade, suddenly find the courage to resurface? You know, in the wizarding world today, there isn't just Dumbledore, there's also Atticus Blaine. Unless what? There was only one possibility. These Death Eaters might have sensed that their master was regaining strength. Many eyes are on Hogwarts, watching Dumbledore and Atticus Blaine closely. With the Tri-Wizard tournament taking place at Hogwarts, it's hard not to be suspicious. So Harry, I urge you to remain as vigilant as possible while at school. If you notice anything amiss, don't take any risks. Dumbledore, Atticus Blaine, or Moody are all trustworthy individuals. Let them handle any problems that arise. End of this chapter. Chapter 590. Harry pursed his lips and blinked, finally understanding why Sirius appeared so tense. Sirius believed that Voldemort was becoming active again and would undoubtedly make a move. The first person Voldemort would target was Harry himself. With the recent unsettling events in the Triwizard Tournament at Hogwarts, which also involved his close friend Hermione, Sirius feared Harry might act impulsively and put himself in danger. Harry felt a wave of annoyance, but knew Sirius wouldn't treat him like a naive child. Despite this, he remained resolute in his stance. Hermione, sensing Harry's discontent, gently touched his arm, signaling him to observe Sirius more closely. Sirius, seated nearby, was watching Harry with a melancholic and cautious expression. This sight made Harry's heart pound, and his eyes grew warm with emotion. In the photo album Hagrid had given him, Sirius, as the best man at his parents' wedding, appeared as a spirited and handsome young man. Now, the man beside him seemed older, no longer the fearless figure he once was, but someone burdened with worries. "All right," Harry muttered, unable to refuse. "I'll try not to show off, okay?" Hermione burst into laughter, knowing how difficult it was for Harry to make such a promise. "Oh, appropriate adventures can still continue," Sirius said, relieved, his posture straightening as a bright smile spread across his face. "I assume you two haven't had lunch yet?" "Excuse me," Sirius called to Mrs. Rosmerta behind the bar, raising his hands. "Could you bring us something to eat? I'm starving, and I want more." Soon, Mrs. Rosmerta brought over delicious chicken sandwiches. Harry and Hermione, both in the throes of rapid growth, eagerly reached out from under the invisibility cloak to grab the food. As they devoured the sandwiches, Sirius smiled and asked casually, "By the way, I forgot to ask why Ron didn't come with you. Is it because James's invisibility cloak can't fit all three of you anymore?" Hermione's expression turned uneasy. Although Sirius couldn't see her eyes, she still looked away. "Well," Harry said, struggling to swallow his food, a hint of dissatisfaction in his voice. "I invited him, but he didn't want to come. He lent the firebolt and said he wanted to play Quidditch." "Oh." The smile on Sirius's face faded slightly. He raised his eyebrows and asked softly, "Is Ron unhappy recently?" Fortunately, the bar was bustling with customers, and the noise masked Harry's violent coughing as he choked on his food. He took a few swigs of butterbeer that Sirius had discreetly passed under the invisibility cloak. With Hermione's constant patting on his back, the blushing Harry finally caught his breath. "How did you know?" Harry gasped, looking at Sirius in shock. "Isn't it obvious?" Sirius replied, not with smugness, but with concern. "Harry, you, Hermione, and Ron have always been the closest of friends. You've always been the most famous among the three of you. And now, Hermione has become a champion in the Triwizard Tournament. From what I've heard, this tournament's impact will be greater than any before. Atticus Blaine seems to have reached a cooperation. In the bustling bar, turned their heads in surprise, their conversations momentarily pausing as they caught sight of Harry and Hermione. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of curiosity and tension, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Atticus Blaine, who had been quietly observing from a corner, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with interest. He had always been intrigued by the dynamics of the trio, and this revelation seemed to add another layer to the complex tapestry of their friendship. Sirius, sensing the weight of the moment, placed a reassuring hand on Harry's shoulder. "Remember, Harry," he said gently, "friendships are like any other relationship. They require understanding and communication. Ron may be feeling overshadowed, but it's important to address it openly." Harry nodded, his resolve hardening. He knew that confronting Ron was necessary, not just for the sake of their friendship, but for the peace of mind of everyone involved. He glanced at Hermione, who gave him a small, encouraging smile despite the tears still glistening in her eyes. As they made their way out of the bar, the whispers and murmurs of the patrons followed them, a reminder of the ever-watchful eyes of the wizarding world. But Harry was determined. He would find Ron, and they would have the conversation that had been long overdue. Outside, the cool evening air was a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere inside. Harry took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation, but also a sense of clarity. He knew that this was a turning point, not just for him, but for all of them. As they walked towards the Gryffindor Tower, Hermione spoke softly. "Harry, whatever happens, remember that we're all in this together. Ron cares about you, even if he doesn't always show it." Harry nodded, grateful for her words. He knew that the path ahead might be difficult, but with Hermione and Sirius by his side, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they would navigate the complexities of friendship, jealousy, and the ever-present shadow of danger that loomed over them. Everyone around stared at Atticus Blaine in shock, but Harry paid no attention to their gazes. He gritted his teeth and took a deep breath. "But before that, I'm going to give him a swollen nose. Maybe that'll knock some sense into him." "Harry," Hermione called out, but Harry was already grabbing his invisibility cloak and dashing out the door. She tried to catch him, managing only to grasp the corner of his cloak, which slipped through her fingers as she watched helplessly. Harry ignored the curious glances from those around him, the fire in his heart threatening to consume him entirely. He couldn't fathom how Ron could entertain such foolish ideas, especially since he had kept them hidden from Harry. To Harry, it felt like a betrayal. Just as he was about to open the door, someone on the other side pushed it open, intending to enter the three broomsticks. Unable to stop in time, Harry collided forcefully with the person. The woman, clearly not as sturdy as Harry, let out a cry of pain and nearly toppled backward into the arms of the man following her. Atticus Blaine caught Fleur as she stumbled into his arms, her face contorted in pain and her nose bleeding. He glanced at Fleur, then at Harry, who stood by the bar, holding his head in his hands, speechless. End of this chapter. Chapter 591, Speechless. In the early morning, the mist dissolved in the gentle breeze and the pink-gold sunlight. After breakfast, the villagers of Hogsmeade climbed onto their carriages and headed to their fields. With Halloween behind them, they urgently needed to harvest the meager pumpkins and plant cabbages, hoping to turn a profit before Christmas. Truthfully, these villagers, lacking significant magical talent, were not much different from Muggle farmers. In fact, they were at a disadvantage compared to Muggle farmers. Due to the constraints of the Wizard's Secrecy Act, they couldn't utilize the advanced agricultural equipment invented by Muggle scientists. They only possessed a few minor spells and magical tools, which offered limited assistance. Consequently, their lifestyle and work methods had remained largely unchanged for centuries, much like their ancestors in the Middle Ages. The villagers of Hogsmeade were relatively fortunate, as their proximity to Hogwarts meant that most of their produce was purchased directly by the school, sparing them considerable worry. In contrast, villagers in Cornwall, Dingworth, Upper Flagley in Yorkshire, Ottery St. Catchpole on England's south coast, and Godric's Hollow in the southwest were not as lucky. The magical world had a limited population and couldn't consume all their produce. They were forced to sell their goods to Muggles, but this presented challenges. Their efficiency lagged behind that of Muggle farmers, and legal restrictions required Wizarding World produce to undergo strict approval before entering the Muggle market. This meant they had to spend gold to navigate bureaucratic hurdles, and their final selling price held no advantage in the Muggle world. To survive, deception and tax evasion became almost essential skills for magical farmers reliant on the land. Of course, they had ways to make their lives more comfortable, but they were reluctant to abandon their magical heritage. Are they serving Hogwarts? Atticus Blaine led the young wizards from Bobens and Durmstrang through the forest shrouded in cold mist on the road from Hogwarts to Hogsmeade. The young wizards were in high spirits, eager to visit the renowned Hogsmeade, the only pure wizarding village in the UK. Atticus did not restrain their enthusiasm, and some of the more impatient ones ran ahead toward the village, which loomed in the mist. Fleur and Gabrielle followed him closely. Fleur seemed to have shaken off the bad mood caused by Hogwarts' mistake in selecting 4 champions. She looked around with interest. When Atticus suddenly stopped in a field, observing the busy villagers, Fleur asked, "Are they serving Hogwarts?" "No," Atticus replied, shaking his head slightly, his tone somber. "They're just making a living." The workers he had seen in the industrial area of Diagon Alley, along with the villagers before him, represented the true underclass of the magical world. They were too ordinary, too humble, and those in power, high above the clouds, could not see these dusts. Fleur glanced sideways at Atticus Blaine. His eyes held an incomprehensible light of pity and concern. "Let's go," Atticus said, shaking his head as he led the group onward across the wilderness. "Oh, sister, did you see it?" Gabrielle exclaimed, bouncing around like a joyful sprite, curious about everything. As Hogsmeade came into clearer view, Gabrielle noticed a house standing on a high slope adjacent to the village. She pointed it out to Fleur in surprise. "There's a house there, but it's—" "Who would live there?" someone asked, eyeing the dilapidated structure. "That's the Shrieking Shack," Atticus Blaine replied with a knowing smile. "It's famous for being the most haunted place in the UK. "Wow!" Gabrielle exclaimed, shrinking behind Fleur. Despite her fear, curiosity got the better of her, and she stole a glance at the eerie house perched on the hillside. Many of the students accompanying Atticus shared her intrigue, their faces alight with eager anticipation. "I wouldn't recommend taking any risks here," Atticus cautioned. "The house is ancient and has been neglected for years. I'm not sure if it could withstand a group of people barging in without collapsing." "So, there are no ghosts there, right?" Fleur inquired, her interest piqued. Atticus chuckled softly. "I don't think so, but there was once a werewolf living there." He paused at the village entrance, smiling warmly at the guests. His gentle demeanor caused many of the young witches from Beauxbaton to blush and their hearts to race. Even Fleur found herself captivated by his charm. "Now, you have free time to explore this ancient and mysterious village," Atticus announced. "Just be sure to return here by 5 o'clock this afternoon. Hogsmeade has many shops worth visiting. Honeydukes offers hundreds of candies with unique flavors, a favorite among Hogwarts students. Zonko's Joke Shop is stocked with prank items that are sure to bring laughter. Scrivenshaft's Quill Shop can meet all your school supply needs. For those who appreciate fashion, don't miss Gladrag's Wizardwear, though be prepared to spend a bit more. If you're hungry, head to the Three Broomsticks pub for some butterbeer. The landlady is quite charming. However, I must warn you against visiting the Hogshead pub. The owner is as grumpy as the Hogwarts headmaster on holiday. If you insist on going, be ready to be thrown out." The villagers had gathered around, observing Atticus and the uniquely dressed students with a mix of awe and curiosity. Atticus, not fond of being the center of attention, quickly wrapped up his instructions and waved the students off. "Go on, enjoy yourselves." The students, eager to explore, scattered in all directions like birds freed from a cage. Atticus stretched, contemplating how to spend his own time. The Three Broomsticks was tempting, but he knew it would soon be crowded with students. He longed for some peace and quiet. Just then, he noticed Fleur and Gabrielle lingering nearby, watching him intently. "Oh, come on, Miss Delacour," he said with a hint of exasperation. "Don't waste your time following me. Go have fun." Fleur, unfazed by his words, flashed him a sweet smile. "Madame Maxime instructed me to stick with you. That way, if anything happens to the Beaubaton students, she'll know who to hold accountable." Atticus's expression darkened slightly. It was a solid reason, and he couldn't find a way to argue against it. End of this chapter. Chapter 592, Customized Competition Uniforms. The shops in Hogsmeade primarily cater to the young wizards of Hogwarts. On days when Hogwarts is not in session, most of these shops see little foot traffic. Along the main street, where many of these establishments are clustered, shop owners often lean lazily against their doorframes, soaking up the weak sunlight and chatting about the upcoming Triwizard Tournament. Although the number of visiting students from Beaubatons and Durmstrang isn't large, their presence injects life into the otherwise quiet village, transforming it into a bustling hub of activity. The idea to bring students from both schools to Hogsmeade originated from Gabrielle's suggestion. Both Atticus Blaine and Dumbledore agreed it was a necessary step to ease tensions between the visiting schools and Hogwarts. Fleur, in particular, was in high spirits, which surprised Atticus. He had long known her to be proud and disinterested in anything related to Hogwarts, yet she seemed far more captivated by Hogsmeade than the school itself. Their journey through the village covered less than a quarter of a mile, as Fleur and Gabrielle were fascinated by nearly every shop they encountered. Atticus soon realized the challenge of shopping with women. The last time he had endured such an experience was in his previous life. He couldn't let two delicate ladies carry their purchases, especially since one was a young girl not yet old enough for magical education. Out of politeness and a sense of gentlemanly duty, he offered to carry their bags. This gesture allowed the sisters to fully enjoy their shopping spree. It was evident that they came from a well-off family, as they showed no concern for how much gold they spent on the peculiar products offered by the shopkeepers. As long as something piqued their interest, they purchased it without hesitation. This was quite taxing for Atticus, who found himself nearly buried under the weight of their acquisitions. In desperation, he resorted to using magic to levitate the bags filled with candies, chocolates, and an abundance of fireworks. Perhaps Gabrielle found Hogwarts' nights too dull behind him. Walking down the street, Atticus felt conspicuous. Villagers passing by stopped to snicker at the amusing sight, and some even took out their cameras. The worst part was the way these villagers looked at him and Fleur, whispering and discussing some rather thrilling topics. When the two girls finally emerged from the last shop, two more packages floated around Atticus like satellites. Fleur noticed Atticus's darkened expression, but showed no remorse. Instead, she tossed her hair back with a proud smile, a tactic she often employed. The villagers, with their weak magical abilities, were easily swayed by Vila charm, and their resistance to Fleur was even less than that of the young wizards at Hogwarts. If Fleur hadn't been with Blaine, some might have been tempted to approach her. Noticing the peculiar glances from the villagers, Atticus felt a twinge of apprehension. He wanted to avoid any potential scandal. "Rhaegar," he called out, and with a pop, the house elf he had once helped appeared before him. Rhaegar seemed to have recovered from her previous weakness and bowed low to Atticus, her gaze fixed on the ground. "Great Professor Blaine, what can Rhaegar do for you?" she asked. Beaubatons also employed house elves, so Fleur was familiar with the creature. She watched with curiosity, wondering what Atticus would request of the elf. "Could you please," Atticus's voice softened, "take these ladies' luggage to their residence?" "It would be Rhaegar's honor," the elf replied, bowing even lower, waist-deep thought. Then, with a crisp snap of his fingers, Atticus Blaine vanished along with the exaggerated packages. "Miss Delacour," Atticus began, pursing his lips, "I just remembered I have something urgent to attend to, if you don't mind." "Oh," Fleur suddenly exclaimed with delight, pointing to a shop not far away. "That's the Fengya Wizard clothing store. It's quite famous, and even Hogue has a branch in Paris. The weather here is colder than I expected, and I could use a few more clothes." Women always seem to need more clothes, regardless of the weather. Ignoring Atticus's words, Fleur happily dashed towards the store, leaving Atticus and Gabrielle standing there, wide-eyed. Gabrielle fluttered her eyelashes and smiled sweetly at Atticus, as if confident he wouldn't abandon her. Everything is for the harmony and stability of the European magical education community, Atticus reminded himself, sighing. Let's go. After visiting this store, I hope to find a place to rest. I'd rather face Dumbledore than go shopping again. Sister always loses track of time when she shops for clothes. We might even miss dinner, Gabrielle chuckled. The little girl seemed to trust Atticus implicitly. She tugged on his sleeve, leading him towards the Fungya Wizard clothing store. By the time Gabrielle pulled Atticus inside, Fleur had already set her sights on a dress. She was admiring a gown hanging high on the wall, while the store owner smiled and provided details. It was a stunning white dress made of smooth silk, exquisitely cut to create a breathtaking silhouette. The skirt was adorned with star-like diamonds, exuding elegance and nobility while maintaining an immaculate appearance. "What do you think?" Fleur asked, clearly pleased with the dress. Her blue eyes sparkled as she turned to Atticus. "It's very beautiful, but I don't think it's suitable for class or a walk in the field. Plus, it won't keep you warm," Atticus replied politely. Gabrielle covered her mouth, giggling, while Fleur raised her nose in mock indignation, instructing the owner to take the dress to the fitting room. Women have a unique fascination with buying clothes, regardless of age. Gabrielle, too, was captivated by the store's offerings, sifting through the racks with interest. Meanwhile, Atticus quickly claimed the only stool in the shop, grateful for a moment's rest. This was Atticus's first visit to the store. During his early years at Hogwarts, he had been financially constrained. His scholarship barely covered his basic educational needs, and his robes were modest purchases from Madame Malkin's shop. In later years, when he managed to earn some extra money, he invested it all in magical research, never spending on personal attire. Some of his Slytherin classmates, however, enjoyed flaunting their purchases from this store. Atticus's gaze wandered aimlessly around the shop. To him, there was nothing particularly special about it. Many of the clothes seemed to differ only by the addition of ribbons or pendants at the waist. But suddenly, something caught his eye. He stood up from the stool and walked to a less noticeable corner. Here, instead of extravagant dresses or ornate robes, hung a few simple double-layered garments. They resembled Muggle sportswear but appeared quite stylish. Atticus touched the fabric, nodding unconsciously. It felt smooth and durable. He took a few steps back, examining the dim gray-blue outfit. His eyes held a deep, thoughtful light as he became lost in contemplation. Lost in deep thought, Atticus Blaine was startled by Fleur's voice, which broke the silence from behind him. "Do you like that dress?" she asked, her tone tinged with mild surprise. Atticus, who had been absorbed in his own musings, took a moment to respond. "Oh no," he stammered, suddenly aware of his surroundings. He glanced down at the plain sportswear he was wearing and ran his fingers over the fabric. "I think this outfit works well as a competition uniform," he replied, trying to sound convincing. End of this chapter. Chapter 593, The Bridge of the Nose is Broken. Atticus Blaine turned to look at Fleur, who had just donned a white silk dress. The gown seemed tailor-made for her, perfectly accentuating her graceful curves. The dress, crafted with exquisite detail, highlighted her elegant collarbone and was adorned with diamonds and half-cuts. Tassels on the sleeves emitted a soft white glow, while a few inches of delicate white gauze above the tube top subtly concealed her décolletage. This design enhanced her allure, making the 17-year-old appear like a blossoming flower, standing as the center of attention. Even Gabrielle, who was always by Fleur's side, was momentarily taken aback by her sister's beauty. The shop owner, well over 50, gazed at Fleur with envy. However, Fleur's expression was one of discontent as she eyed the plain sportswear behind Atticus. "You expect us to appear before the entire European wizarding community in those dreadful clothes?" she questioned. "I think they're quite suitable," Atticus replied calmly, seemingly unfazed by Fleur's transformation. "To ensure the competition is presented effectively to the audience, and for your safety, the Tri-Wizard tournament requires warriors to wear standardized attire. This is part of the competition's charter." "Impossible," Fleur retorted firmly. "I know every rule by heart, and there's never been a dress code for warriors." That was before, Atticus replied nonchalantly. Starting this year, I've added this to the Warrior Code regulations in the safety plan. Warriors who don't comply will have points deducted, even if they complete the task perfectly. Fleur was furious, her chest rising and falling with indignation. She had never encountered someone who could discuss abusing power for personal gain so calmly and convincingly. Atticus then turned to the shop owner. I need 4 sets of these costumes for the tournament warriors. I'll notify you when to come to Hogwarts to take their measurements. How long will it take, and what will the cost be? Just 2 days, Mr. Blaine. The shop owner was trembling with excitement, aware of the promotional opportunity this presented. As for the fee, it won't cost you a thing, Mr. Blaine, as long as you'll allow me. Oh, I'm sorry. I can't agree to your request, Atticus interrupted, shaking his head. I can't allow advertising on the game server. If you want to advertise, you'll need to negotiate with the goblins. I've already inquired, the shop owner grumbled. The advertising fees those goblins demand could buy an entire fire dragon. Well, Mr. Blaine, I can offer you a discount. Considering each warrior has 3 tasks, customizing 10 sets would be more reasonable. Including attendance costs, you only need to pay 150 gold galleons. Atticus was impressed by the shop owner's shrewdness. He raised an eyebrow, acknowledging her business acumen. Very well, as you suggest. When you come to Hogwarts for measurements, I'll have Argus settle the fee for you. You're really going to make us compete in those hideous outfits, Fleur exclaimed, her eyes wide with disbelief. No, you can't do that. Of course I can, Miss Delacour, Atticus replied confidently. Atticus Blaine twisted his neck, producing a series of crackling sounds. He rubbed his brow, looking a bit weary, and asked, Are you done? Do you plan to buy this dress? Fleur was so flustered by Atticus's sudden question that she momentarily forgot about the dress she had been admiring. His reminder jolted her back to the present. What? Oh, the dress, she exclaimed. Taking a few deep breaths, she decided to set aside her irritation to maintain her good mood. What do you think? Fleur asked, a smile returning to her pretty face. She spread her arms and twirled, showcasing the dress to Atticus. I already have a dress for the Yule Ball, but I think this one is even better. What do you think, if you like it? It's not bad, Atticus replied succinctly. Fleur's face was full of anticipation, hoping for more feedback, but Atticus seemed to have said all he intended. He turned to gaze out the window, noticing the light rain that had begun to fall. Muttering his dissatisfaction, he seemed lost in thought. Fleur stood frozen, as if under a petrifying spell, her cheeks reddening and her breathing quickening. Gabrielle, who had been watching the scene unfold, covered her mouth to stifle a laugh. No more! Fleur suddenly shouted, storming into the changing room in a fit of anger. After the incident at the Fungya Wizard clothing store, Fleur's enthusiasm for shopping waned significantly. She walked back sullenly, ignoring Gabrielle's whispered words of comfort. She didn't notice Atticus following her, his expression a mix of apology and resolve. As Fleur headed back to the school's carriage, the wind and rain intensified. Gabrielle, trying to keep up, sneezed, her bangs soaked by the rain. Her thin frame shivered in the cold wind. Gabrielle's pitiful eyes tugged at Fleur's heartstrings. All right, Fleur said, wrapping an arm around Gabrielle's shoulders. She scanned the shops on either side. Let's find a place to take shelter from the rain and grab a bite to eat. Realizing it was lunchtime, she spotted the Three Broomsticks bar, its foggy windows hinting at the warmth inside. Fleur carefully led Gabrielle across the slippery floor, while Atticus glanced at the bar through the window. His brows furrowed slightly, and he quickened his pace. Feeling Gabrielle's cold arm, Fleur's concern deepened. She quickly opened the mist-covered door and ushered Gabrielle inside to warm up. Just as they stepped in, a dark figure rushed out at high speed. The reckless individual wasn't watching where they were going. Before Fleur could react, something hard collided with her nose, and she cried out in pain. The impact threw her off balance, and she stumbled backward, expecting to hit the ground. Instead, she found herself against a solid chest. Atticus had caught her, preventing her fall, and steadied Gabrielle, who was also about to topple. He stabilized the sisters, then turned to check on Fleur, whose nose was now red and swollen. With a heavy sigh, he muttered, "Potter and Granger." He looked over at Harry, who was clutching his forehead in shock, and Hermione, who was rushing over, clearly alarmed. Today isn't Hogsmeade's open day, is it? How did you end up here? End of this chapter. Chapter 594. Disappointment. Could anyone be more unfortunate than me? Harry thought despairingly as he spotted Professor Atticus Blaine entering his line of sight. He had sneaked off to Hogsmeade with Hermione, only to run into Professor Blaine and inadvertently injure the Beauxbatons champion. It was rumored that this girl, who seemed to have Vela blood, had already been injured once in Hagrid's pumpkin patch. The headmistress of Beauxbatons was furious about the incident, and even Dumbledore had been alerted. Harry glanced at Fleur, whose nose was bleeding profusely. Her injury seemed no less severe than the last time. Hermione rushed to Harry's side, her eyes widening in shock and panic as she realized the injured person was Fleur, her opponent and the Beauxbatons champion. Fleur's nose was a mess, and her collar was stained with blood. Atticus Blaine, however, was not concerned with how Harry and Hermione had ended up there. Sirius was pushing through the crowd of onlookers, determined to reach the inner circle. "Let me see," Atticus said softly, kneeling beside Fleur, whose tragic state made him feel dizzy. The girl was clearly having a rough time. He didn't question Harry and Hermione further, but focused on helping Fleur. Fleur let out a painful sob, not wanting everyone to witness her embarrassment. Her blue eyes filled with tears as she looked at Atticus with a sense of grievance. Fortunately, non-magical injuries were not too troublesome to handle. Atticus pointed his wand at Fleur's nose, and the trickling blood stopped immediately. Her nose, which had been crooked, straightened again. However, there was a larger issue at hand. Beauxbatons champions were being injured one after another, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for Madame Maxime to manage. Gabrielle, Fleur's sister, helped her up and glared angrily at Harry. "Why did you hurt my sister?" Fleur recognized Harry and Hermione, two Hogwarts students, one a champion, and the other who had given her directions to Atticus in the Great Hall the night she arrived at Hogwarts. People in Blaine's office had said he was the famous Harry Potter. Fleur refrained from getting angry immediately because she wanted to see how Atticus would handle the situation. Sirius finally managed to push past the strong Durmstrang students. He glanced at Harry and Hermione, who were bewildered by the incident, and then at Atticus, who appeared calm yet slightly embarrassed. After all, Harry and Hermione had been summoned by his letter. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Sirius said apologetically to Fleur, shielding Harry and Hermione behind him. "The child who just hit you is my godson. We had a conflict, and he was a bit emotional. We are willing to compensate." "I'm sorry." Atticus also nodded towards Fleur, his tone apologetic. "I didn't fulfill my duty." Fleur glanced at Atticus, feeling an inexplicable disappointment. She realized that Atticus's apology was not because he was on her side. On the contrary, he wanted to take responsibility for the two young Hogwarts wizards. "No," Harry, still pale, stood up from behind Sirius. He looked at Fleur and said, "It has nothing to do with Professor Blaine. This is my fault. I'm sorry. You can punch me in the nose if you want." "No need to feel indebted. It was just an accident," Fleur replied, shaking her head in dismay. "Let's go, Gabrielle. I'm no longer interested in this place. Let's go back to the carriage." With that, she pulled Gabrielle, who was glaring at Harry indignantly, and without even saying goodbye to Atticus, she turned and left quickly. Fleur's dismissive attitude made Harry feel even more guilty, and at the same time Atticus Blaine was a little more frustrated with Ron, but dealing with him would have to wait. First, he needed to address the situation with Professor Blaine. There was no doubt that he had caused trouble for the professor. If the girl reported back to her principal, Professor Blaine would have to expend considerable effort to appease Beauxbaton's anger. "Sorry, Professor Blaine." Harry stammered, struggling to find the right words. Sirius stood behind him, smiling confidently, as if certain that Atticus wouldn't punish Harry and Hermione too harshly. "Come to my office after dinner, Potter and Granger, to discuss your punishment for sneaking out of school," Atticus said sternly, casting an irritated glance at Sirius. After successfully making Sirius look embarrassed, he turned to Harry and Hermione. "Now, return to school immediately and stop wandering around, or I'll have to inform Professor McGonagall." "Go on," Sirius encouraged, patting Harry on the shoulder. Stay inside the castle after dark and have a good talk with Ron. Feeling as if they had been granted a reprieve, Harry and Hermione quickly left the bar, their heads down, disappearing from view under the curious gazes of the patrons. "Care for a drink, Atticus?" Sirius offered with a smile. "I had planned on it," Atticus replied, his expression darkening, "but I'm not in the mood now." The bar was no longer a suitable place for conversation, as a crowd of onlookers had gathered both inside and outside. "What happened between Harry and Ron?" Sirius asked as they turned into a secluded alley across from Patty's tea house. Standing under the eaves, Atticus inquired casually, "Did the two have a falling out?" "It's about Hermione being a champion," Sirius explained with a shrug. "You know, Ron's always felt overshadowed by his siblings and wants to stand out, but he rarely gets much attention when Harry's around." Atticus nodded in understanding. In their small group, Harry naturally drew attention wherever he went, while Hermione was also well known for her excellent grades and her role as Hogwarts's fourth champion. Being friends with these two exceptional young wizards, it was understandable that Ron felt the pressure and scrutiny. However, Atticus had no intention of intervening. This was their personal matter, or rather, an inevitable part of growing up. "Tell me about Barty Crouch," Atticus said. "Has he been up to anything unusual lately?" "You know, Atticus, I can't always be at the ministry," Sirius replied, frowning. "But when I do go back to hand in assignments, I pick up bits of information from others. Nothing out of the ordinary. He works as hard as ever, often the last to leave the ministry. If there's anything to note, it's Percy." "Percy," Atticus prompted. "I heard from Arthur, who was bragging a bit. Old Barty seems to think highly of Percy. He's letting him make decisions on some less critical matters while he spends most of his time in the office. It's not a big deal, really. Apparently, he was injured on a recent inspection trip to Hungary. He was supposed to recuperate at St. Mungo's, but we all know he wouldn't waste his precious time there. He might be low on energy, so it's not surprising he's delegating some tasks to Percy." Sirius observed Atticus, who was deep in thought, his brow furrowed. "What's going on, Atticus? Why do you want me to keep an eye on old Barty? Do you think what's happening at Hogwarts is connected to him?" The light in Atticus's eyes flickered, hinting at the complexity of his thoughts. Atticus Blaine remained silent, his gaze steady on Sirius. From Atticus's demeanor, Sirius quickly realized that extracting any information from him would be futile. "All right," Sirius sighed. "I understand you have many important matters on your mind, but I hope you can help look after Harry, and of course, Hermione and Ron. They're all quite anxious about their roles as champions." Atticus and Sirius hadn't spoken much recently, as they had been communicating through letters about certain sensitive issues. Although Atticus agreed to Sirius's request, he knew he wouldn't involve himself too deeply. Until Voldemort's plans were thwarted, he intended to keep his distance from the trio. The rain fell softly, shrouding the landscape in a misty veil, with only the green mountains visible in the distance. Atticus emerged from the alley, longing to return to Hogwarts. However, with many students from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang still in Hogsmeade, he needed to wait until just before dinner to gather them and head back to the school. Contemplating how to pass the time, he decided to visit the Hogshead Inn. It was relatively quiet during the day, offering a brief respite. Yet, as he turned to leave, Atticus hesitated, glancing back at the wizarding clothing store where Fengya had gone earlier. End of this chapter. Chapter 595, Showdown. Harry! In the dim and crumbling secret passage, Hermione desperately pursued Harry. Despite her training, she found herself lagging behind him, unable to match his athletic prowess. No matter how hard she tried, the gap between them only widened. "Stop, Harry!" she called out, her voice tinged with urgency as the path began to curve. Hermione realized they were nearing Hogwarts. A pang of regret struck her. She wished she hadn't told Harry that Professor Atticus Blaine didn't intend to hold him accountable for injuring Fleur. Professor Blaine had summoned them to his office that night, ostensibly to punish them for sneaking out of school, which had eased Harry's worries. Yet, she also regretted not sharing Ron's recent behavior with Harry, which was likely the root of his anger. Harry felt betrayed, not just by Ron, but by Hermione's silence as well. "Listen to me, please, Harry." Hermione's voice cracked with emotion, tears threatening to spill. Harry heard her pleas, but a fire raged within him, consuming his thoughts. Running was the only way to quell the discomfort. As he sprinted through the dark passage, memories of his years at Hogwarts flashed before him. His first meeting with Ron and Hermione on the train, their adventures saving the Philosopher's Stone, investigating the basilisk, and pursuing the innocent Sirius in the Forbidden Forest. They had flown to Hogwarts in Mr. Weasley's car and used the time-turner to capture Peter Pettigrew. Their friendship had seemed unbreakable, akin to the bond between Sirius, Remus, and his parents. But now, Sirius's comparison to Peter left Harry unsure if he was more angry or afraid. He just wanted to find Ron and punch him squarely on his freckled nose. Suddenly, a burst of white light blinded Harry, halting him in his tracks. Dazed, he stood still for a few seconds, allowing Hermione to catch up. She emerged from the hunchbacked witch's statue, her hair disheveled and tear tracks visible on her cheeks. Harry rushed to the corridor window, squinting at the grounds below. Hermione, panting, grabbed his robe tightly, but Harry, having confirmed his suspicions, yanked it back and prepared to storm off. "What are you planning, Harry?" Hermione blocked his path, arms outstretched. Harry never imagined he'd speak to Hermione so harshly, but he retorted stiffly, "Move, Hermione. I'm going to find Ron Weasley and break his nose. If I could, I'd crack open his head to see what ridiculous ideas are inside." "Please, Harry," Hermione pleaded. "Sirius just wants you to talk to him." "I'll talk to him," Harry shouted, "but not until his nose looks like Fleur Delacour's. Otherwise, he won't think straight." Unable to deter Harry, Hermione watched helplessly as he charged through the castle. Under the astonished gazes of many, Harry descended, determined to confront Ron. Atticus Blaine dashed up the stairs to the auditorium like a gust of wind, leaping down the marble steps in front of the foyer in just 2 strides, and hurried towards the venue. On the field, Ron, Seamus, and Dean were showing off, with Ron riding Harry's firebolt. Seamus and Dean, using the sweep series brooms, were left far behind. Despite the misty drizzle, their spirits were high, and they reveled in the game. "Get down!" Atticus shouted, his anger flaring at the scene before him. He drew his wand, sending a brilliant red light into the sky, and yelled, "Get down, Weasley!" The sudden commotion disrupted Ron and the others, nearly causing a mid-air collision. They quickly spotted Atticus on the ground, yelling at them. After exchanging confused glances, Ron guided the firebolt to a slow descent. "What's wrong?" Ron asked, glancing at Seamus and Dean, who had fallen behind, then at Atticus and Hermione, who had arrived looking distressed. Atticus remained silent, his gaze fixed on Seamus and Dean. It was clear he was angry, especially with Hermione subtly signaling them to leave quickly. "We forgot to have lunch," Dean said tactfully, patting his forehead. He exchanged a look with Seamus, and the two quickly made their exit. "What's going on?" Ron frowned, puzzled. He looked at Hermione, who had her head lowered, avoiding Atticus's eyes. To be honest, when Atticus finally faced Ron, he was at a loss for words. Although he wanted to punch Ron in the nose, he restrained himself. "Didn't you go to see Sirius?" Ron asked, unable to get a hint from Hermione. His eyes flickered with unease as he briefly met Atticus's gaze before quickly looking away. "Yes?" Atticus nodded, breathless. "Thanks to him, I figured out some things, like how you always wanted an ugly scar on your forehead or something." "Harry, don't do this," Hermione whispered, poking Atticus's waist. Her lips were pursed tightly, tears welling up in her eyes. Ron's face turned pale, his pupils shrinking as fear seeped into his eyes. His expression made Atticus feel a mix of pity and satisfaction. To be honest, Atticus hadn't been happy lately. Hermione had been chosen as a champion in the tournament, and many arguments proved it wasn't just a prank, but a well-planned conspiracy. He had been fighting against it. Ron seemed worried, and Atticus thought Ron shared his concerns, or even more so, but it turned out to be nothing like that. "You don't understand, do you?" Atticus clenched his fists, staring at Ron. "What do you think about Hermione becoming a champion?" Hermione bit her lower lip, hugging herself and turning away, not wanting Atticus and Ron to see her tears. If Ron's face had been pale before, it was now devoid of any color. He looked at the firebolt in his hand, wishing he could fly away from Atticus and Hermione. "What's the matter? You have nothing to say, right?" Atticus gasped, his tone filled with a bitter pleasure. Perhaps you finally realize you're a fool and an idiot, right? I'm not a fool, Ron suddenly shouted, raising his head and meeting Atticus's eyes with anger. I'm not an idiot either. End of this chapter. Chapter 596, Ron suddenly erupted in anger. He furiously smashed Harry's firebolt beneath his feet and shouted at Harry. His unexpected outburst startled both Harry and Hermione. Is that so? Harry replied coldly after a brief silence. In my opinion, you're a complete fool. A strong wind swept through the venue from the Forbidden Forest, carrying rain that turned into misty threads. The sudden chill made Hermione shiver, but it was nothing compared to the coldness she felt in her heart. Let's stop this, okay? She pleaded, her voice echoing across the empty field. Apart from the three of them, no one else was in sight. Her words, however, only seemed to fuel the anger between Harry and Ron, who were locked in a tense standoff. You have no right to say that to me, Ron spat through gritted teeth. Unlike Hermione, Harry was consumed with rage. He glared at Ron, finding him irritating from head to toe, including the few inches of skin exposed by his too short trousers. The wind and rain seemed to have no effect on him. You know full well that being a warrior isn't what Hermione wants, Harry shouted, his vision blurred by either the rain or his anger. Yelling at Ron seemed to clear his mind. You know people will mock her now, and you know the dangers she faces aren't just in the competitions. But you ignore all that, thinking only of those ridiculous galleons and fame, yet you think you're not a fool or an idiot. Don't act like you're the only noble person in the world, Potter, Ron roared, his voice louder than the crashing waves on a cliff. He wanted to rush forward and smash Harry's glasses, but he managed to restrain himself. Seeing Harry stunned by his words gave Ron a moment of satisfaction, but he no longer wanted to stay. He glanced at the helpless Hermione, his lips parting slightly, eyes filled with hesitation. In the end, he said nothing and turned towards the castle. Don't leave, coward! Harry's shout was filled with fury. Ron's retreat only fueled his anger further. He charged forward, and the word coward made Ron lose control. In the pouring rain, the two best friends began to throw punches at each other. Harry and Ron tumbled onto the muddy lawn, their roars mingling with the howling wind and rain, which seemed to mock the immature teenagers as they experienced the growing pains of adolescence. Hermione rushed forward, desperate to separate them, but it was impossible for her to stop two enraged boys. In the struggle, someone's elbow struck her front teeth, causing her to cry out in pain and nearly faint. Oh my God! The ground trembled slightly as Hagrid approached with long strides, unable to believe what he was witnessing. He hurried to the boys wrestling on the ground, and like picking up chickens, he grabbed each by the arm and lifted them from the mud. Despite this, Harry and Ron continued to curse and kick at each other with their free limbs, creating a rather comical scene. Merlin's beard! Hagrid exclaimed, blinking his beetle-like eyes as he tried to identify the muddy-faced boys in his grasp. Seamus and Dean just ran over and told me you might be fighting. I thought they were joking. I was teaching Dom how to handle the blast-ended scroots, ointment from a jar. Hold still, Hermione, he instructed gently, applying the salve to her swollen lips with surprising tenderness for someone of his size. Hermione winced but nodded, her eyes watering slightly from the sting of the ointment. Thank you, Hagrid, she managed to say, her voice muffled by the pain. Meanwhile, Atticus Blaine and Ron stood awkwardly by the door. Their earlier anger dissipated in the face of Hermione's obvious discomfort. Atticus's face was flushed with embarrassment, and he couldn't meet Hermione's eyes. I'm sorry, Hermione, he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Ron, equally contrite, added, Yeah, me too. We didn't mean for you to get hurt. Hermione gave them a small, forgiving smile, though it was clear she was still in pain. It's okay, she said softly. Just try not to fight next match. All right? Hagrid, satisfied that Hermione was being taken care of, turned his attention back to the boys. Now what was all this about? He demanded, his voice stern but not unkind. Atticus and Ron exchanged a glance, each waiting for the other to speak first. Finally, Atticus sighed and said, It was stupid, really. We just got into an argument, and it escalated. Ron nodded in agreement. Yeah, it was dumb. We shouldn't have let it get that far. Hagrid shook his head, a mixture of exasperation and amusement on his face. You two need to learn to control your tempers. You're friends, after all." The boys nodded, chastened. "We will," Atticus promised, and Ron echoed his sentiment. "Good," Hagrid said, his tone softening. "Now, let's get you all warmed up and fed. There's stew on the stove, and I reckon you could all use a hot meal." As they settled around the table, the warmth of the hut and the aroma of the stew began to lift their spirits. Atticus and Ron exchanged sheepish smiles, and Hermione, despite her injury, managed a small laugh at their expense. In the cozy confines of Hagrid's hut, the earlier tension melted away, replaced by the comforting camaraderie of friendship. Atticus Blaine carefully applied the ointment to Hermione's injuries, just as Hagrid had instructed. Despite his rugged appearance, Hagrid possessed a surprising talent for healing. After all, not every magical creature was as benign as a flobberworm, and frequent visits to Madame Pomfrey were impractical. Thus, Hagrid often tended to his own injuries. As the soothing ointment touched Hermione's skin, her burning lips cooled, and the pain etched between her brows eased significantly. "Hermione, your front teeth seem a bit loose," Hagrid observed, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket and offering it to her to wipe away the dripping liquid. Hermione, however, declined the gesture. "You should probably visit Poppy later to get it checked out." "Thank you, Hagrid. I'll do that," Hermione replied gratefully, accepting the warm water Dom had brought to rinse the metallic taste of blood from her mouth. Dom then effortlessly dried Hermione and Harry's soaked clothes with a flick of his wand. The aroma of beef stew simmering on the stove filled the room, causing Hermione and Harry's stomachs to rumble in anticipation. They had been running back and forth between Hogwarts and Hogsmeade through the secret passage, caught in the rain, and were now famished. Harry's stomach growled audibly, a testament to the energy he and Ron had expended. Dom quickly found 2 gleaming bowls, ladling generous portions of stew into each, and handed them a large piece of rock cake. "Thank you, Dom," Hermione said, waving her hand dismissively, feeling a bit downcast. "I don't think I can eat this right now." "This cake has been improved by Dom," Hagrid assured her. "It's much tastier now, just not as hard as before. But let's set the cake aside for now." Hagrid turned his attention to Harry and Hermione, his expression serious. "Can either of you explain what's going on? Harry, why did you get into a fight with Ron? Is fighting Malfoy not enough for you anymore?" End of this chapter. Chapter 597, Each Other's Perspective. Hagrid had always been one of their most trusted confidants, and Harry felt no need to hide anything from him. As soon as Hagrid posed his question, Harry eagerly recounted the events. From the week after Hermione was chosen as a champion, Ron's behavior had been off, a fact that Sirius had only just pointed out. Harry also expressed his frustration with Hermione, feeling she should not have kept Ron's odd behavior a secret. Faced with Harry's accusation, Hermione lowered her head in sadness, remaining silent. Meanwhile, Tom eyed Harry with a look that suggested he was considering throwing him out of the house. "Don't cause trouble, little one. We are discussing serious matters," Hagrid warned Tom, then sighed and asked, "What do you think Hermione should do, Harry? The conflict between you was sparked by her becoming a champion. She knew she couldn't make Ron happy, but if I tell you what Ron thinks, consider the consequences. Do you think Hermione wants to see you and Ron fighting? This incident will hurt her the most." Hagrid gently patted Hermione's shoulder as she wiped away her tears. It reminded Harry of last year, when Ron mistakenly thought Crookshanks had killed Scabbers, and Hermione would often come to him in tears. Seeing her like this made Harry's heart ache, and he found himself unable to blame her any longer. Instead, he muttered resentfully, "It's all Ron's fault." "Come on, Harry," Hagrid interjected sharply. "Anyone who raises a fist at their friends is a fool. Both you and Ron have your issues." Hagrid's words brought back Ron's recent comments at the venue. Harry stood up abruptly, eager to explain, but Hagrid waved him off with his large hands. "I know what you're trying to say, Harry. You think it's foolish for Ron to be jealous of your fame and Hermione's status as a champion. You're friends, and regardless of the fame you have, Hermione's role as a champion isn't something you sought. But have you ever considered the pressure Ron is under? He could choose not to bear it, right?" "What do you mean?" Harry frowned, while Hermione remained silent, seemingly aware of what Hagrid was about to say. Since you two entered this school, you've been good friends. One of you is the famous boy who lived, and the other is an outstanding student admired by professors. Following you, Ron has endured being overlooked. Has he ever complained about this? Harry, do you think Ron would be more comfortable if he were friends with Seamus and Dean? You know the Weasley family's situation, Harry. Why do you think Ron, neglected at home, should follow you at school and remain unnoticed? To be honest, I think he's done quite well. He even beat Professor McGonagall's magic chess, which not many young wizards can do. Harry only absorbed part of what Hagrid said, focusing on Ron's potential desire to befriend Dean and possibly abandon him and Hermione. He's clearly trying to do that, Harry said, troubled but still angry. Look, Hagrid spread his hands. You're also responsible for Ron's behavior, right? Because you never formally acknowledged his pain. In other words, you ignored or didn't realize it at all. But he didn't blame you. He's been suffering silently, but this time, Hermione's situation has pushed him over the edge. Both of his good friends have become famous worldwide, and he's the only one left. But it's not our fault, Harry retorted angrily. If he's willing to be an orphan or be targeted by deadly conspiracies, then maybe he can become famous. Why don't you understand? Hagrid's voice rose, tinged with frustration. You know the pressure Ron is under is real, not exaggerated, so why should he bear this burden just because he's your friend? He could have distanced himself from you the moment he felt overwhelmed, but he didn't. It's clear Ron values the friendship he's built with you, right? Hagrid's tone was sharp. Ron hasn't mentioned his struggles because he still wants to be your friend. Sure, he's had some issues lately, but that's normal, isn't it? You can't expect anyone, especially a young wizard, to handle everything without needing to vent. A heavy silence filled the wooden cabin, broken only by the crackling of the blast-ended scroots in a box on the other side of the wall. Harry stared ahead, fists clenched, unsure where to direct his anger. He realized he hadn't considered the pressure Ron felt as their friend. So, you think this is a problem between me and Hermione? Harry asked slowly, his green eyes blazing. I didn't say that, Hagrid replied, his voice calming. Ron does have a problem. He shouldn't neglect or distance himself from you because of Hermione's role as a champion. But you need to understand, Harry, there's a reason for his behavior. Give Ron some time to process his feelings. I believe you'll reconcile, rather than questioning why he isn't as noble as before. Harry's expression hardened, feeling a pang of guilt as he glanced at Hermione. Was this what she had been trying to tell him earlier, when she chased after him in the secret passage? Had he misunderstood everything? What do you think we should do now, Hagrid? Hermione finally spoke, her eyes brimming with tears. I can't give you a definitive answer, Hagrid sighed, standing up to adjust the stove's air inlet valve. But my advice is not to confront Ron immediately. Take some time to reflect on what friendship means. Once you've calmed down, maybe you can have a proper conversation, like Sirius suggested. Harry worried about what would happen if Ron truly decided to distance himself from him and Hermione. According to Hagrid, that seemed like the easiest path for Ron. Yet Harry was still angry. Couldn't Ron wait a little longer before reacting? He should understand that this is a crucial time for Hermione. Right, Hermione, Hagrid said, turning his attention to her. How are you preparing for the competition? Hermione sniffed, trying to compose herself. I've found some information about tasks from past Triwizard tournaments, but I'm not sure if they'll be useful. I doubt they'll repeat the same challenges. This little guy has been worried about you, Hagrid said, ruffling the fur of a creature named Daum. It's a shame they don't allow helpers, or you could take him with you. End of this chapter. Chapter 598, Fatal Forgetfulness. Hagrid had mentioned it offhandedly, but Harry's instincts kicked in, and he immediately turned to Hermione. Is it possible? He asked, his voice tinged with urgency. What? Hermione replied, momentarily taken aback by Harry's unexpected question. Most people tend to underestimate the power of house elves, but Harry was not one of them. He was well aware of the remarkable magic they possessed. Back in their second year, Dobby had used his magic to block King's Cross Station and the entrance to the Wizarding World, leaving Harry and Ron helpless. Moreover, Dobby had easily overpowered Malfoy's father. If Hermione could enlist the help of her loyal elf, Dom during the Triwizard Tournament, it could significantly boost her chances of success. I mean, could Dom participate in the Triwizard Tournament with you? Is that allowed by the rules? Harry asked eagerly. Bringing Dom into the competition? That's impossible, Harry. Crouch made it clear that we can't accept help from anyone. In the tournament, we can only rely on our own wands, Hermione replied, her eyes widening in surprise. She instinctively wanted to dismiss the idea, but her raised eyebrows betrayed a flicker of consideration. Harry's face lit up with hope. So, there's no explicit rule against it, right? Dom is a house elf, not a wizard. Besides, he belongs to you, doesn't he? Can you do it, Master Granger? Dom stood up straight, trying to appear more formidable. Dom is willing to accompany Master Granger in the competition. Dom wants to help Master Granger. Dom's tennis ball-sized eyes shone with a pleading look. Hagrid hadn't expected Harry to take his offhand comment seriously. He glanced at Dom, blinking with a hint of hesitation. No, Hermione began, acknowledging the temptation of Harry's proposal. Having a helper during the competition would undoubtedly ease the burden of any challenge. However, Hermione knew she couldn't take advantage of Dom's loyalty. She took a deep breath and decisively refused. I can't do this, Harry. It's too unfair, Hermione said firmly. Seeing Harry's persistence, she continued, You've seen the past tournament events, Harry. They're too dangerous. Dom is still a child, not even a year old. I can't involve him in something so perilous. Besides, Dom doesn't belong to me. He's free. There's no need for him to risk his life for me. Dom belongs to Master Granger. Master Granger gave Dom clothes. Dom clutched the vest, modified from Hermione's robe, and insisted, Dom wants to help Master Granger win the game. Stop it, Dom. Hermione covered her mouth, feeling a familiar ache in her front teeth. If you really want to support me, then cheer for me during the game. Could cheering be interpreted as helping? Dom blinked, falling silent. Hermione's refusal brought a sense of relief to Hagrid. He had spent time with Dom and knew the house elf was indeed a valuable companion. Dom could even keep him company during patrols at night, something Fang couldn't do. Don't worry, Hermione, Hagrid said, glancing out the window and lowering his voice. Professor Blaine has kept the details under wraps. No one knows the specifics of the first task except him and Dumbledore, but if they plan to bring something into Hogwarts, I'll catch wind of it. Harry and Hermione exchanged a look, momentarily speechless at Hagrid's subtle offer to help. The prospect of gaining insider information lifted Harry's spirits. If they could anticipate the challenges ahead, they could devise a strategy to tackle them. However, Hermione remained hesitant, her mind torn between the ethical implications and the potential advantage. To Hermione, the competition was akin to an exam, a sacred event where cheating was unimaginable. Despite Harry and Hagrid's best efforts to persuade her otherwise, Hermione remained steadfast in her beliefs. However, by the time they left Hagrid's hut, she was slightly less opposed to the idea. After Hagrid's intervention, Harry's anger towards Ron had subsided, but neither he nor Hermione was eager to see Ron just yet. They decided to have dinner at Hagrid's and stayed there until dawn. As they made their way back to the castle under the cover of darkness, hoping to avoid anyone in the Great Hall, Hermione tripped on one of the vanishing stair traps, injuring her front teeth. In the school hospital, Madame Pomfrey examined Hermione's teeth with a critical eye. "Oh, how did your front teeth end up like this?" Madame Pomfrey asked, her tone a mix of concern and exasperation. "I was thinking about the competition, madam, and didn't notice the disappearing stair trap," Hermione replied, her voice tinged with regret. "Can my teeth be fixed? My father is a dentist, and if he sees my crooked teeth during the Christmas vacation, he'll definitely make me wear braces." Harry stood nearby, feeling a wave of guilt wash over him. Whether it was his fault or Ron's, Hermione had been caught in the crossfire of their argument. Madame Pomfrey, with her years of experience, could tell that Hermione's tooth had been injured for some time. Yet, she was a skilled healer and rarely concerned herself with the peculiar reasons young wizards found themselves injured. "Who do you think you're underestimating, Miss Granger?" Madame Pomfrey said, slightly indignant. "With just a cup of chocolate milk, I can restore your teeth to their original state, or even better. Potter, please wait outside the curtain for a moment. You should know better." Harry, though annoyed at being sent away for something as simple as a tooth repair, complied and waited outside. Madame Pomfrey took her time, enough for Harry to imagine drinking a whole bucket of chocolate milk. He could hear Hermione and Madame Pomfrey whispering behind the curtain, though he couldn't make out their words. After half an hour, Hermione emerged, her lips tightly pressed together to hide her newly repaired teeth. "Come on, Harry, let's go back," she said, relieved that Harry didn't pry. She had taken the opportunity to have Madame Pomfrey do a little extra work on her teeth, especially after the teasing she endured from Malfoy and his friends with their whimsical badges. As they headed back to the dormitory, Harry's anxiety resurfaced. Returning meant facing Ron again after their unprecedented argument that afternoon. Despite Hagrid's advice to remain calm, it was easier said than done. "Did we forget something?" Hermione suddenly asked as they climbed the stairs to Gryffindor Tower, lost in their thoughts. "What?" Harry responded absent-mindedly, a sudden chill running down his spine as realization struck him. "Oh, Professor Blaine!" they both exclaimed in horror, remembering their appointment with him. Panicked, they turned and sprinted back down the stairs, utilizing the speed and agility honed in their physical education classes. Hermione even vaulted over the guardrail in her haste. Atticus Blaine navigated the stairs with the agility of a parkour athlete. 9 o'clock! In a panic, Harry glanced at the watch Professor Blaine had given him, strapped securely to his wrist. He shouted desperately, "It's over, Hermione!" "Do you think Professor Blaine will believe we're trying to avoid his punishment? What if he does to us what he did to George in the last PE class?" "Don't ask me," Hermione exclaimed, leaping over another guardrail. Her voice was fraught with frustration. "I don't know anything. If you two don't come." 10 minutes later, the two arrived at Professor Blaine's office, breathless and anxious. They knocked on the door, their hearts pounding in their chests. Atticus Blaine sat at his desk, his gaze fixed on a large gift box in front of him. As Harry and Hermione stumbled in, drenched in sweat, he greeted them with a wry smile. "I was just about to head to the Gryffindor dormitory to find someone," he remarked, his tone teasing yet firm. End of chapter. Chapter 599. A heated encounter. Harry and Hermione were likely the young wizards who had the most private interactions with Professor Atticus Blaine. They both knew that, in private, Professor Blaine was not one to flaunt his authority. Whenever they visited his office, he would kindly invite them to sit before discussing matters formally. However, this time was different. Professor Blaine had them stand, his gaze stern and unyielding. This subtle shift in demeanor made both Harry and Hermione uneasy. It seemed their latest escapade had truly vexed Professor Blaine. It was no surprise, really. While Professor Blaine was strict about punishing them for sneaking out of school, they understood that injuring one of Bobaden's champions was a far graver offense. Unsure if Madame Maxime had already approached the castle to address the incident, Harry gathered the courage to steal a glance at Professor Blaine. The professor's face, shrouded in the flickering candlelight, was inscrutable, devoid of any hint of emotion or anger, which only heightened Harry's anxiety. "I'm sorry, Professor," Hermione began, her voice breathless. We encountered something." Professor Blaine's expression softened slightly. He surmised that Harry and Hermione had likely gone to find Ron after returning to Hogwarts, and it was foreseeable that some conflict had arisen. He shook his head in disbelief. "How about it, Hermione? Are you prepared for the Triwizard Tournament events?" he inquired. Hermione's body trembled, her heart pounding in her chest. Hagrid had only recently confided in her and Harry that Professor Blaine had been keeping the tournament details tightly under wraps. Yet, Hagrid had still planned to help her gather some inside information. I was researching previous tournament records," Hermione stammered. "I thought it might be helpful." "Well," Professor Blaine raised an eyebrow at Hermione's nervousness. Under normal circumstances, he might have offered her some extra assistance. After all, she was the youngest of the champions, and becoming one was not her original intention. However, after some thought, he decided against it. It was best for him and Dumbledore not to interfere too much in the tournament process, and she might not have anyone to rely on. "As for the two of you sneaking out of school, Gryffindor will lose 20 points. Of course, detention is unavoidable, but considering the pressure of the tournament, I won't impose any additional punishment." Harry and Hermione looked up, astonished. "Is that all, Professor?" Harry asked incredulously. "Of course, it's not that simple. Have you forgotten about Miss Fleur Delacour, whom you injured?" Professor Blaine's words wiped the surprise from Harry's face, prompting a chuckle from the professor. It was late, and he didn't wish to prolong the conversation. "Harry, I know you didn't intend to harm Miss Delacour. Normally, I wouldn't punish you for this, but given her status as a Beauxbatons champion, it's inappropriate to dismiss it as a mere accident. Therefore, Hogwarts must apologize to her." Even without Professor Blaine's prompting, Harry and Hermione understood this. Fleur had indeed been unfortunate. In just a week at Hogwarts, she had been injured twice, albeit accidentally. Beauxbatons would undoubtedly have concerns. "What do you need us to do, Professor?" Harry asked, knowing they had to make amends. "I've prepared a gift for Miss Delacour, a dress," Professor Blaine said, tapping the gift box in front of him. He looked at them expectantly. Atticus Blaine looked at Harry and said, "I hope you can give this to her personally as an apology, in your name, of course, Harry." Harry and Hermione turned their attention to the box in front of Professor Blaine. Harry initially thought someone else had given the box to Professor Blaine. Given Professor Blaine's current fame, receiving gifts from fans wasn't unusual. However, he was surprised to learn that this was a gift Professor Blaine had purchased to apologize to Fleur. Harry opened his mouth, feeling both frightened and moved. "If Miss Delacour asks why you bought this, you can tell her that you sought my advice on how to express your apology, and it was my suggestion. Go quickly. It's already very late. Use the invisibility cloak to your advantage. If you're caught by other professors or prefects, I won't admit to anything." Harry and Hermione left Professor Blaine's office in a daze. It wasn't until they reached the foyer and felt the cold wind blowing outside the castle that Harry suddenly realized something. "Do you think I should repay Professor Blaine for the gift, Hermione?" he asked. Harry's question was valid, but Hermione couldn't provide an immediate answer. Logically, he shouldn't let Professor Blaine pay for his mistake, but Hermione believed that Professor Blaine must have felt some responsibility, which is why he took the initiative to buy the gift. The light from the castle windows was insufficient to illuminate the grounds. The campus was shrouded in darkness. Harry and Hermione braved the howling wind and stumbled toward Beauxbatons' carriage. Wearing the invisibility cloak, they navigated the slippery, muddy grass from the day's rain, falling several times and staining their robes with mud. Since Beauxbatons and Durmstrang had arrived at Hogwarts, no one had entered their residences. There seemed to be some kind of warning magic surrounding Beauxbatons' carriage. As soon as they approached the door, adorned with 2 golden-crossed wands, it opened on its own. A boy in a light blue robe peered out cautiously. "Hogwarts students, I remember you. You're the 2nd champion of Hogwarts." The boy recognized Hermione and Harry standing under the golden spiral staircase. He easily identified Hermione, which made him even more cautious. "What do you want?" "We'd like to see Fleur Delacour. Well, because of something that happened during the day," Harry said, taking a deep breath of cold air and speaking awkwardly. "What happened during the day?" The Beauxbatons boy was puzzled. His question made Harry and Hermione wonder if Fleur hadn't mentioned being hurt again. However, many people had witnessed the incident during the day, though it seemed that those present at the Three Broomsticks pub were mostly from Durmstrang. Hermione nudged Harry's ribs subtly. "We came to deliver something to Miss Delacour. It's something she bought in Hogsmeade earlier but forgot to take, and we happened to come across it." "Oh, didn't that elf deliver everything?" the boy muttered, sounding a bit displeased. However, he didn't question Hermione's explanation. After saying, "Wait," he closed the door with a bang. The light inside the carriage clearly reflected the white breath escaping from Harry and Hermione's mouths and noses. The weather was so cold that Harry could hear the sound of ice flakes floating on the rippling black lake, squeezing and colliding with each other. Before they turned into popsicles, Fleur finally appeared. She wore a thick cloak and pushed open the carriage door. Despite the cold wind that seeped in, making her shiver, Fleur wrapped herself tightly in her cloak and carefully stepped out. Atticus Blaine descended the spiral staircase, his footsteps echoing softly in the dimly lit corridor. As he reached the bottom, Fleur eyed the box in Harry's hands with suspicion. "Lavi mentioned you sent something I left in Hogsmeade?" she inquired. Harry cleared his throat, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Well, actually, we got you a gift to apologize for what happened earlier today." "A gift?" Fleur's voice, still tinged with a nasal quality due to her not fully recovered nose, sounded hoarser than usual. She blinked in surprise, noticing the muddy water clinging to Harry and Hermione's clothes. Her tone softened. "Oh, that's not necessary. It was just an accident." But curiosity got the better of her, and she asked with interest, "What did you get me?" "A dress," Harry blurted out quickly. Atticus Blaine had gone to great lengths to help them, and it would be unreasonable not to present the gift. He held the box out to Fleur, his eyes filled with anticipation. Perhaps it was Harry's earnest demeanor that swayed Fleur. Though initially hesitant, she reached out, her hand emerging from the folds of her cloak, clad in a light blue shirt. She gently untied the ribbon and opened the box. "Oh, this is," she exclaimed, recognizing the dress she had admired at the Fengya Wizard clothing store earlier that day. Her initial delight was quickly replaced by suspicion. "How did you know I liked this dress?" Harry, caught off guard, relayed the explanation given by Atticus Blaine. However, Fleur wasn't ready to drop the subject. She scrutinized him, her eyes narrowing. "This dress isn't cheap. It's too extravagant for an apology gift. How much did you spend on it?" Harry hesitated, unsure of how to respond since Atticus hadn't provided an answer to this question. He glanced at Hermione for help. "We're quite familiar with the store owner." Hermione interjected smoothly, her composure unshaken. "She gave us a discount, so we only spent a few dozen galleons." To Harry, Hermione's response seemed perfect, yet unexpectedly, Fleur burst into laughter. Her doubts vanished, and she happily accepted the gift from Harry, causing her cloak to slip to the ground. Harry's face flushed, and he quickly averted his gaze, embarrassed. Fleur, however, leaned in and kissed Harry's cheek gently, leaving him feeling as though the spot she kissed was burning. She then turned to Hermione, intending to do the same. "Oh, don't do that!" Hermione exclaimed, startled, and backed away, eyeing Fleur with a mix of surprise and amusement. "All right," Fleur chuckled, shrugging with a sweet smile. She picked up her cloak and wrapped it around herself once more. "Thank you. I accept your apology." With the gift box in hand, Fleur ascended the golden spiral staircase, her steps light and joyful. Just before entering the carriage, she turned back to the astonished Harry and said with a smile, "Thank Mr. Blaine for me too." End of this chapter. Chapter 600, The Secret Conversation Exposed. Fleur closed the carriage door, leaving Harry standing there, still touching the spot where Fleur had kissed him. He stared at the golden wand emblem on the door, lost in thought and unable to regain his composure for quite some time. "Humph!" came an angry snort. Startled, Harry turned to see Hermione glaring at him. "What's going on?" he asked, bewildered. "Still savoring it, are you?" Hermione's voice dripped with sarcasm as she glared at the carriage. "If you're so reluctant to let it go, why not knock on the door and ask if she'd like to kiss your other cheek?" Harry's face flushed with embarrassment. He hadn't asked for this, and Fleur's sudden gesture had caught him off guard. "Are we going to see Professor Blaine again?" he asked, trying to change the subject. Girls' minds were a mystery to him, and he didn't want to risk further upsetting Hermione. With his friendship with Ron strained, he valued his bond with Hermione even more. "Why?" Hermione raised an eyebrow. "To report to Professor Blaine that we've completed the task," Harry replied, trying to sound casual. Besides, Fleur wanted us to convey her gratitude to him. As soon as the words left his mouth, Harry regretted mentioning Fleur again. He couldn't understand why Hermione was so upset with Fleur, but he saw her mutter something under her breath before storming off towards the castle. The journey back was more challenging than the trip there. Hermione, still angry, refused to walk beside him, forcing Harry to awkwardly hold the invisibility cloak over both of them. He stumbled along, trying to keep up with her. As they neared the castle, Harry accidentally stepped into a small puddle, losing his balance. He let out a startled cry and fell forward, knocking Hermione to the ground with him. "Who's there?" A cold, stern voice echoed from the left side of the marble stairs, hidden behind a prismatic corner of the castle. Instinctively, Harry and Hermione curled up, pulling the invisibility cloak tightly over themselves. They covered their mouths, not daring to make a sound. Professor Blaine had warned them that if they were caught by other professors or prefects, he wouldn't be able to help them. Who's eavesdropping there? A milky white light suddenly illuminated the area, revealing a sinister face. Even before seeing him, Harry and Hermione knew who it was. The voice belonged to the staff member Harry despised most at Hogwarts, Severus Snape. Snape advanced cautiously, his wand raised, trying to identify the source of the disturbance. Harry realized Snape was bluffing. Although the invisibility cloak wasn't perfect, Snape didn't have the ability to see through it. "Stop looking, Severus," a voice interrupted from the darkness. The sudden appearance of Igor Karkaroff, the headmaster of Durmstrang, nearly startled Harry and Hermione. His silver fur robe gleamed in the hall's firelight, but his expression was one of impatience. "Perhaps it was just a fox that ran out of the woods and accidentally broke its leg," Karkaroff suggested as he walked behind Snape. Harry noticed Snape's mouth twitching slightly. Uneasily, Snape squinted and paced the lawn, searching for the source of the noise. Fortunately for Harry, Snape never approached him and Hermione, sparing them from being discovered by their footprints on the grass. "Stop wasting time, Severus. Why did you call me here?" Karkaroff demanded impatiently. Hermione blinked, realizing from Karkaroff's words that it was Snape who had initiated this meeting. But how did they know each other so well that Snape allowed Karkaroff to address him by his first name? As these doubts formed in her mind, Hermione's expression shifted. She recalled Sirius mentioning that the headmaster of Durmstrang was a Death Eater, and there were unsavory rumors about Snape as well. Unable to find any clues, Snape seemed resigned. He extinguished the light from his wand and turned to face Karkaroff. "I have something to ask you, Igor. For the sake of our friendship, I hope you can tell me the truth. You know that lies cannot stand before me." "What do you want to know?" Harry strained to hear over the howling wind, curious about Snape's inquiry. When Snape finally spoke, Harry was so shocked that his heart skipped a beat. He glanced at Hermione, who appeared equally stunned. "Hermione Granger is the silly little girl who was chosen as the second champion of Hogwarts. Igor, did you do this?" Harry was desperate to know the answer. He peered through the dim firelight at Karkaroff, whose expression was one of incredulity. "Is this a joke, Severus?" Karkaroff exclaimed, his mouth opening wide in exaggerated disbelief. "You suspect me? This is absurd. Why would I throw that little girl's name into the goblet of fire? Why would I add more competitors for myself?" Snape remained unmoved, his gaze piercing. "Don't you find it interesting, Igor, that when we discussed this issue that night, Atticus Blaine and Moody's arguments were compelling?" Karkaroff seemed to have considered Blaine and Moody's theories deeply. Though he found Snape's question abrupt, he defended himself fiercely. "This is so foolish, Severus. Utterly foolish." Karkaroff paced in front of Snape, then suddenly stopped, glaring at him. "You actually think I would do it?" Realizing his reputation might not be stellar, Karkaroff interrupted himself and changed his explanation. "I was with my students that night, Severus, and they can vouch for me." "You must have found time to slip away, right?" Snape retorted coldly. "And then took a stroll around the castle?" Harry had never seen Snape so unyielding. Even with Snape's back turned, Harry could sense the intensity of his gaze as he pressed Karkaroff, trying to break through his defenses. Yet Harry also felt a flicker of confusion. From these questions, it was clear Snape wasn't responsible for Hermione's predicament. But why was he so eager to investigate this matter? Was it under the orders of Professor Blaine or Professor Dumbledore? It seemed they both knew something about Snape and the headmaster. Durmstrang had a history of serving Voldemort, and there was an unusual relationship that prompted them to send someone to investigate. Karkaroff was so incensed by this that he laughed derisively. "Has the comfort of Hogwarts dulled your sharpness, Severus? What am I supposed to do? Just stroll into the hall with such bravado and accuse a young girl I've never even seen before?" "Of course, you wouldn't be so blatant, Igor," Snape replied, stepping forward and fixing Karkaroff with an intense stare. The cold gleam in Snape's eyes was so piercing that Karkaroff instinctively looked away. There's an interesting coincidence. On the very night you and the Beauxbaton delegation arrived at Hogwarts, something went missing from my storeroom: bicorn powder and African tree snake skin. You know exactly what these are used for, don't you, Igor? Granted, the brewing time is tight, but with some foresight, there are ways to expedite the process. End of this chapter.